Today's story is about a church in Memphis that begins to experience very strange phenomena. Now, at first, church administrators believe that whatever's happening here is just a series of pranks, and basically everybody writes it off. But one church staff decides to look more closely, and he discovers something much darker was going on there. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, for the next several days, sneak into the Like Button's kitchen after hours and add increasingly large portions of food that they hate to their fridge and their pantry. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. One morning in late February of 1982, a 42-year-old man named Sam Drash was standing inside of his office, which was inside of a United Methodist church building in Memphis, Tennessee. And as he stood there, he was frustrated. His arms were crossed, and he was staring down at an empty bowl on his desk. So Sam was the headmaster of an elementary school that was inside of this church. This church building was massive. It not only had, the main chapel and this elementary school, but there were also dozens of offices. There was a full gymnasium, a full kitchen, laundry facilities. I mean, this place was massive. As for Sam, he spent the majority of his time in his office doing administrative work for the elementary school. And because he was at his computer all the time, just kind of doing this busy work, he found himself wanting to snack a lot. And so he needed like a healthy snack to binge on. And he found, mixed nuts were the thing he liked to eat the most that were, sort of healthy. And so he always had this big bowl of mixed nuts on his desk that he always kept full. But this morning, when he walked into his office, this big bowl of mixed nuts was inexplicably empty. And he knew the night before he had filled the bowl up, and he didn't come in between last night and now, so, who ate the mixed nuts? And so feeling pretty annoyed, he's like, all right, somebody must have come in here and taken them, okay, fine. And so he left his office and headed to the kitchen to get some more snacks. When Sam went inside the kitchen, he saw the church's cook was at the counter cutting vegetables. And so Sam said hello to the cook and then walked right over to the pantry where the snacks were. He opened it up and he looked at the shelf where the mixed nuts always were, and the entire container was gone. And in addition to that, Sam's scanning the other shelves and seeing that a lot of snacks that he knew were typically in this pantry were also gone. It was like someone had raided the entire pantry. And so Sam, he turns to the cook and goes, hey, was there like an event here last night where they would have handed out a lot of snacks? Because I feel like all the snacks are gone here. And the cook, who at that point was still chopping vegetables, he stopped, put the knife down, and he turned and looked at Sam and said, I'm glad somebody else has noticed this, because for the last month, food has been going missing for no reason. I don't understand what's happening here. The cook told Sam that at first, the food that was going missing was pretty minor. It was really just snacks and just here and there, not a big deal. But he said more and more lately, it wasn't just snacks going missing. It was actually stuff from the fridge. And he told Sam that, at night, he put a padlock on the fridge specifically to keep people out of it, in particular the kids, who would come in and like raid the fridge. He's like, it's locked. But, last night he said he put a ham in the fridge, this whole ham. He put it in the fridge and then he shut and locked the fridge. And then this morning when he came in, he opened the fridge up and the ham was gone. And he literally walked over to the fridge, opened it up and showed Sam the shelf where this huge ham was supposed to be, but now it was just gone. The cook told Sam that he had already spoken to church administrators about this strange issue, when he flagged this morning that this ham was now gone. And while they said they'd look into it, they admitted to the cook that they really didn't know what to think of it. It was just very confusing how this was even happening. At this point, Sam was just totally irritated because now he knew, one, he would have to go do his admin work without any snacks. But two, it was pretty clear that, some of the kids, probably from his school, had likely begun sneaking into the kitchen and taking snacks. And also very likely, they must have gotten a hold of the key to the padlock on the fridge, and now they're kind of escalating, stealing whole hams from the fridge. I mean, this whole thing was just totally annoying and really bad behavior. And so Sam figured he would likely have to deal with the kids at some point. But Sam told the cook, look, for right now, what I'll do is I'll also talk to administrators and I'll have somebody come in here and they'll replace the lock on the fridge. A few days later, on March 3rd, Sam walked into the church building and began heading down the hallway towards his office. For the past couple of nights, things have been quiet at the church. Sam had the lock replaced on the fridge, and it seemed like that had solved the issue of things going missing in the fridge. And also Sam had replaced his mixed nuts supply, and nobody had taken any. So it seemed like, whatever was going on, maybe there was a prankster or something that clearly, changing the locks and maybe putting some additional pressure on the church administrators to let people know to stop doing this had its effect, because things were back to normal. But as Sam was walking down the hallway, he passed by the kitchen, which was open, and as he passed by, the cook who was in there saw Sam and said, "Hey, come in here, I gotta show you something." And so Sam stopped, he goes into the kitchen, and the cook is standing by the fridge, and the fridge is open, and he can kind of see there's a look on the cook's face like, "Hey, you gotta see this." And so Sam kind of has a sense of where this is going. He walks over to the cook, and the cook points to an empty spot in the fridge. And he said, "Look, right there. There should have been several bottles of soda right there, and they're gone." And so Sam's like, okay, that's not good. Clearly this is still happening. But the cook is like, "No, this is after the locks have been changed. There's only a handful of people that have access to the keys, and it's like church administrators who definitely would not be taking this soda. So I don't understand how this is even happening." And Sam's like, "Yeah, you're right. That does sort of change things. How is this happening?" But before Sam could ask any follow-up questions, the cook was like, "This isn't all either. This is just one thing I've noticed. The other thing that's going on now, ever since we changed the locks, is someone is also beginning to mess with my personal stuff." He told Sam that every day when he was done in the kitchen, when he would leave, he would always leave his work shoes and his apron in one spot in the kitchen. He would leave them right there, he would leave, and then the next morning when he would come back, his things would be right there, he'd put them back on, and he'd get to work. But ever since changing the locks, when he had come into the kitchen, his stuff would be moved. His shoes at one point were on the counter when he came in, and his apron was put somewhere else. But nobody was stealing from him. It was like they were just messing with him. And the cook said to Sam, "I just don't get it. Why are they doing this? This can't be satisfying. They don't even see my reaction to this stuff. What are they doing just messing with my stuff?" Sam was equally baffled by this, and he just told the cook, "Look, I'll talk to administrators again and see if there's anything we can do, change the locks again, I don't know, but I'll see if anybody can help us here, because I really don't understand what's happening." And so Sam left the kitchen and headed down the hallway towards his office, with the intent to go in there and write up a report about what had just happened and hand it over to the administrators. But when Sam walked into his office, he noticed there was something sitting right in the middle of his desk that had not been there the night before. It looked like a paper towel. And so Sam, he walks up and he sees it is a paper towel, but there's a note scrawled on this paper towel, sort of like hectic, chaotic handwriting, like somebody was in a rush writing this note. And clearly they've left this note for him. And so he sits down at his desk and he begins to read the note, and it's totally upsetting. The note referenced the recent murder of this 15-year-old girl named Leslie Gaddis, who had been killed not far from the church in Memphis, Tennessee. This case was all over the news, and so Sam and basically everybody at the church had heard about it. And so he's seeing that the note is referencing this girl, but more than that, the note insinuated that there was something in the church's attic that would change everybody's understanding of this murder case. And so Sam's like, is this a prank? Like an awful prank? Are the kids who are stealing food and messing with the cook's stuff, are they also responsible for this? Sam's thinking, this murder case was all over the news. Everybody, including the kids in this church, had heard about it. This girl had been abducted from her bedroom in the middle of the night. It was horrible. And he's thinking, maybe this really is a prank. But at the same time, Sam's thinking that if this note is true, that there is some horrible thing or some clue or evidence up in the attic that might be useful to police about this case, he had a responsibility to share it with the authorities. And so even though he knew he might be overreacting a little bit to this, he called the police and said, "Hey, you gotta come down here and look at this." And so sure enough, later that day, police showed up to the church, they met with Sam, they read the note, and they went into the attic. And they searched it extensively, but they didn't find anything connected to the Leslie Gaddis murder case. They didn't really find anything of note up there at all. They also searched the entire building, just in case, but there was nothing of note. And so the police told Sam that, look, your first instinct was probably right here, that this was likely a prank. Whoever was maybe messing with your kitchen food, and the cook very likely did this too, I don't know. But, if anything serious happens, about this case or anything else, don't hesitate to reach out, but this does not seem like a big deal. And so the police left, and Sam is just left in his office thinking what do I do here? I mean, like, he didn't know who was messing with the stuff in the kitchen or the cook. He didn't know who had written this note. But it really started to seem like, somebody was up to something, or multiple people were. And he just wanted to understand why. Like, why is this happening? All right, guys, I just did something that I have literally never done before. Not on this YouTube channel, not on any of my podcasts, nowhere. Like, this is a brand new thing, new concept, okay? Now, normally when I, tell stories, it's just me alone talking to a camera or, on stage, but it's just me talking to you. That's the style. That's the MrBallen style, has been for years. But today, it's all gonna change because I interviewed a guest. That's right, we have a new concept called Storytime with MrBallen, where I sat down with the one and only Tom Segura, one of the hottest comedians in the world right now. He's got Netflix specials and shows, mega famous, super cool guy, and an amazing storyteller in his own right. And I talked to him not only about storytelling, but we swapped some stories. I actually told a story that's never been told before on any of our channels. It's really good. And it's just a fun new way of making content. So I think you're gonna love it. It's available right now. It's called Storytime with MrBallen. Let me know what you think. And if you guys enjoy it, I will interview more people and tell more stories like that. The video is live right now. Just click on the link in the description below and have a listen. Let us know what you think and tell us in the comments, because if people like this format, we'll keep doing it, okay? Thank you very much. And now back to the story. Over the next couple of weeks, food continued to go missing from the kitchen, despite locks being changed several more times. The church's cook continued to have his stuff messed with, and more notes, handwritten notes on various pieces of paper and paper towels, began popping up, not just on Sam's desk, but also on other church officials' desks. And these other church officials, when they got them, they were totally convinced that this had to be a prank. But for Sam, he just felt like, I don't know if this is a prank. It's not really funny. It isn't like the person doing it is really getting any big reaction. It's just kind of creepy and unsettling that somebody is, launching this bizarre campaign against the church. It didn't add up. But, even though this is all happening for weeks at this point, the final straw, at least in Sam's mind, happened the previous Sunday when he and his family were at church. And his son was sitting in one of the front pews, and he grabbed a Bible and he opened it up, and sure enough, a note tumbled out of the Bible. It was one of those handwritten notes on a paper towel, and again, it referenced the murder of Leslie Gaddis. And Sam's looking at his young child, his young boy, reading this note, being like, what's going on here? And Sam's like, this is totally unacceptable. It's one thing to be leaving these notes for adults to find, but now, children are gonna be reading these notes? That's not okay. And so on March 17th, so roughly about a month and a half after all this strange stuff had begun happening in the church, Sam went to the maintenance crew of the church building and told them he wanted to set up a stakeout. Because by this point, Sam was starting to think, I don't know if just, some kid or kids from the elementary school are pranking the church. I mean, this has been going on for weeks now. It's sort of dark at this point with these notes that are being left all over the place. This doesn't really feel like just some kid. This actually feels like maybe an adult, maybe an outsider who's coming in to do this. For what reason, Sam didn't know, but he just felt like something's off here. And so his plan was basically he and the maintenance crew would stay in the church at night and literally hide and try to catch whoever this was, breaking in, doing this stuff in the act. By about 10 p.m. on March 17th, it was just Sam and the maintenance crew in their various hiding spots in the church, sort of centrally located so they could see the hallway that led to the kitchen, that led to Sam's office. They're all just kind of positioned, waiting. And so far, nothing had happened. I mean, the church was totally quiet. Everybody else had left for the night. It was just Sam and the maintenance crew. They're just kind of twiddling their thumbs, waiting to see what would happen. And at some point, the maintenance crew, they got really bored because there really was nothing happening. I mean, Sam was super motivated, but the maintenance crew's like, I don't know, I don't really care about any of this stuff. And so one of them decided to just, stretch his legs and just walk around the church, just to do anything other than sit here with nothing happening. And so he got up and he walked down the hallway and he's kind of looking in each room and there's nothing going on. And as he was walking towards the nursery at the end of the hallway, he heard some movement coming from behind him. He turned around and he thought it was, one of the other maintenance workers or Sam, but no, he saw a light come on in the kitchen. And so thinking, oh my goodness, maybe I've caught this person in the act, he charges down the hallway, he goes into the kitchen, and he can't believe what he sees. It would turn out everybody had it wrong about what happened to 15-year-old Leslie Gaddis. She really was, several months earlier, literally taken from her bedroom in the middle of the night, taken out of her house. But she wasn't murdered. Everybody thought she had been, and the news acted like she had been, but she hadn't been. Instead, her kidnapper, 42-year-old Ernest Stubblefield, had taken her in the middle of the night and brought her to this church and had been holding her in the church's attic for the last 119 days. And during that time, Ernest had her at knife point and basically watched her near 24/7 to make sure she wouldn't escape. And the whole time he's telling her, don't worry, I'm gonna get ransom for you, and as soon as I do, you'll be allowed to leave. But Leslie began to realize that ransom was not materializing, and it didn't really seem like Ernest had much of a plan, and eventually he would just have to get rid of her. And so she knew, like, if she didn't save herself, she was likely gonna get killed. And so in the rare moments where Leslie was not being watched by Ernest, like for example, when they were down in the kitchen and getting food after hours, they critically had been listening the whole time, and they would hear when the locks had been changed on the fridge, and they would see where the keys were being hid, and they would just sneak down, get the keys, open the fridge up, and they would eat. Well, when they were doing that, Leslie made a point of not just taking a little food for she and Ernest, but she would take a ton of food, like way more than two people would need, and she would tell Ernest, oh, it's just because, it's more for us. But really what she was doing was trying her best to signal to the people in the church that something weird's going on here, huge portions of food are going missing. And then also she would, move around the cook's stuff, his shoes and his apron. And then in the very rare moments where she truly wasn't being watched, she would run off, grab a paper towel and scrawl things like, my name is Leslie, I'm in the attic, and leave them on people's desks, hoping that that would finally get somebody's attention. But unfortunately, pretty much everybody in the church thought it was a joke, except for Sam. However, when he contacted the police and told them, like, hey, I got this note that sort of suggests that maybe Leslie is being held in the attic, well, they went up there and they searched the attic, and they didn't find her because Ernest had found a special crawl space in the attic that nobody knew about. And so she was just feet away from police, but they didn't know she was up there. But luckily, Sam did not stop. He continued to question what was happening, continued to think all this stuff was super weird. And so eventually he has this stakeout. And that maintenance worker, after being so bored, was doing his loop, saw the light come on in the kitchen, goes in the kitchen, and what does he see? But Leslie Gaddis, alive in the flesh, standing right there. She saw him, Ernest is right behind her, and she just made a run for it and literally dove into the maintenance worker's hands, just praying that he would not run away because Ernest was sure to grab her and do something to her. But the maintenance worker, he grabbed Leslie, Ernest took off running, and he would eventually be caught. Ernest was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 20 years in prison. As for Leslie, she was hailed as a hero for saving herself, and she would go on to become a successful lawyer who would serve on the board of the Commission on Missing and Exploited Children. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. There is a little cottage right on the water in Maryland called Cottage 506. It's a rustic place with a wood fire stove, a couple of small beds, and a small sitting area for breakfast. And then outside the cottage on the porch, you have this amazing view of the water. And then behind the cottage is the resort that the cottage is a part of. And the resort offers guests that stay in this cottage great food, great entertainment. I mean, this is a great spot. However, Cottage 506 has a dark secret. And it's the reason I and many other people will never be staying there. But before we learn about Cottage 506, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to house sit for the like button while they're away for the weekend. But instead of looking after their property, just spend the entire weekend downloading viruses to the like button's computer. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. A little after noon on Valentine's Day 1998, a married couple named Steve and Kim Rico held hands as they walked towards their car. They had just dropped their 8-year-old daughter off at a neighbor's house in the suburban neighborhood in Maryland where they lived, and now Steve and Kim had the whole weekend to themselves, and they were really excited about it because they had this big trip planned. Now, admittedly, Kim had no idea what they were actually going to be doing because Steve was the one who planned it, and he was obviously being very secretive about the details. He wanted this to be a surprise. And so for weeks leading up to this weekend, Kim would see Steve on the phone all the time, presumably planning whatever it is they were going to be doing, but he wouldn't let Kim hear what he was saying on the phone. He would kind of muffle his voice, or he'd hang up before she could come over and hear him. And then also after these secretive phone calls, Kim would often see Steve writing all these notes down in his journal, presumably about whatever it was he was planning. The only details Steve shared with Kim about this trip was, make sure you wear something nice. When the couple reached their car, Steve hopped in the driver's seat and Kim hopped in the passenger seat, and immediately, right after Steve had fired up the car, Kim turned to him and said, "Are you gonna tell me? You gonna tell me where we're going?" But Steve just grinned and said, "Nope, it's a surprise." Kim gave a theatrical sigh and sat back and feigned frustration, but inside, the way she was really feeling was just excited. This was so cool that Steve had put so much effort into whatever it is they were going to do, but also Kim was seeing her husband was really making a big effort to make her happy. And this was kind of new because lately their relationship had been really rocky. Kim and Steve had been married for 9 years by this point, and they were both very, very different people. Steve was a total homebody, kind of introverted, and Kim was the opposite. She was super extroverted and very social. But when they first met each other, it was actually their stark differences that brought them together. For Kim, when they met, she was in her early 20s, she had just dropped out of college, and her experience with men so far had been she would meet them at parties or bars, and at first it would seem like their relationship was great, but then invariably these guys would just kind of move on and break Kim's heart. But Steve was different. He was this huge guy, 6'4", massive football player, but he was totally a gentle giant. And as soon as he met Kim, Kim could tell this guy is different. He's treating her with respect, he's loyal to her, he really cares about her, and so they hit it off right away. And Kim very quickly became pregnant, at which point Steve asked her to marry him, and Kim didn't hesitate for a second. They were totally in love. And marriage to Steve had really been a stabilizing factor in Kim's life. She wound up going back to college and got her degree, which landed her a job as a surgical technician, which is what she did now. And Steve turned out to be just a fantastic father, and he wound up actually staying home with their daughter when she was a baby so Kim could go out and work. And Kim always thought it was funny when she would come home and she would see Steve standing in the doorway cradling this infant, but he's like this massive person, and so their baby looked like a toy. But unfortunately, over the last year, Kim had seen a change in Steve. He went from being a shy person, but a person who could go out and function in society, to a shy person who basically stopped going outside altogether. Steve basically refused to go out anywhere with Kim. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want to spend time with their friends or family. He just wanted to stay home and watch TV or hang out in the basement. I mean, it was pretty obvious he was depressed, but his introvertedness was becoming kind of stifling for Kim. And so Kim approached Steve and said, "You really need to go to therapy to get better here. I'll go with you. We can do couples therapy." But Steve refused. And so finally, right around this past New Year, Kim decided she had just had enough. She was totally unhappy. She did not feel like Steve was going to change. And so Kim told Steve that she wanted to get divorced. And when Steve heard that, he realized the gravity of this situation. He knew Kim was unhappy with him, but he did not know she was thinking about separating. And so Steve kind of broke down and begged Kim to give him another chance. Let him prove to her that he will change, that he wants this marriage to work. And Kim said, okay. And so that was how Steve wound up planning this very secret getaway on Valentine's Day. This trip was supposed to be the start of their new and improved marriage, and so Kim was really excited and optimistic about the future. After driving for about an hour and a half, Steve pulled off the highway and began following signs towards the Eastern Shore, which is a waterfront area of Maryland that's very beautiful, that was located about 70 miles away from Steve and Kim's home. After driving for a few minutes, Steve pulled into the parking lot of the Harbortown Golf Resort, and as soon as he pulled into a spot and turned off the car, he clapped clapped his hands and turned to Kim and said, "Okay, we're here." And Kim looked from her husband out to all the perfectly manicured grounds and the beautiful resort, and she smiled and leapt out of the car excitedly. Kim and Steve took each other's hands and marched inside to check in, and as they were checking in, the person behind the desk gave them glasses of champagne, and then after handing Kim and Steve their key cards, the receptionist told them that their cottage where they were staying was like the nicest property at the resort. Kim and Steve were totally pumped. They took their champagne and their room keys, they walked back to their car, and then drove a little ways deeper into the resort to their cottage. It was cottage 506, and it looked out over the water. And when they went inside, Kim was totally wowed. It was this rustic suite with a wood fire stove in the middle and 2 queen-size beds and a little coffee table area for breakfast over here. It was perfect. And then when Kim actually walked into this cottage, she noticed there was a card sitting on a table, and it looked like a wedding invitation. Kim was confused and looked over at Steve, and Steve just smiled and said, "Go, check it out." And so Kim walked over and she grabbed the note and she began reading it, and as she did, she began to smile. The card really was a wedding invitation, albeit it was for a fake wedding, because it would turn out this was not just a random overnight that Steve had planned for both of them. Instead, he had purchased a romantic getaway package, which included this amazing cottage, but also a professional dinner theater performance that would be held on the resort grounds. Kim read the description of the dinner theater show on this invitation. It was a murder mystery called The Bride Who Cried, where the actors in the show would put on a whole fake wedding, and then at the end of the wedding, somebody would get killed, and the audience would need to figure out who did it. For an extrovert like Kim, an activity like this was perfect. And so Kim felt totally touched that clearly Steve had heard her, and the first thing he did to kind of win her back was to begin to do the things that Kim really wanted to do, which was really going out and having fun. And so after Kim finished reading the card, she turned and looked over at Steve, and Steve was kind of nervous because he wasn't sure if Kim was going to like it. And Kim, she broke into this huge smile. She walked over to Steve and gave him a big hug. And Steve, he was so happy, and he hugged her real tight right back. Kim and Steve would spend the next couple of hours sitting by their fire inside of their nice cottage, drinking their champagne and talking about the future and just telling stories and having a good time. And then around 7 p.m., Steve and Kim put on their nicest clothes and walked their way over to the area on the resort where this dinner theater was going to happen. It was in an event hall with a bunch of round tables set up for the audience. And so once Steve and Kim and the other audience members all took their seats, the actors and actresses came into the room, and they were all dressed in their wedding clothes. There was a bride and a groom and a wedding party, and the audience was instructed to participate in the wedding as if they were wedding guests. And so the audience all stood up, and they began kind of having this fake social hour of meeting all the wedding guests. And then Steve, Kim, and the audience members all took their seats, and they got ready to watch the drama unfold. And Kim, pretty much immediately, was totally absorbed in this performance. She was so enthusiastic, talking to the actors and talking to the other guests, and really pretending like she was part of the wedding. I mean, she was having a blast. The play itself was about a groom who was in the mafia, who was forcing his bride to marry him by threatening her family. The climax came when the groom stood up and gave a toast with his champagne. He took a sip and then fell down dead. Kim watched all of this with delight, but she kept looking over at Steve, hoping he too would be smiling and having a good time. But each time she looked at him, he was just kind of stone-faced and looking straight ahead, like he just didn't care or he was totally disinterested. And then a couple of times when Kim leaned over and said, "Hey, honey, who do you think did it? Who do you think the killer is?" Steve basically just completely ignored her. It was like she wasn't there and the play wasn't there. He was just totally zoned out. Eventually, Kim and a few other very enthusiastic audience members figured out the killer in the play was the bride's mother, who poisoned the groom, and then after this discovery was made, the play was over. As everyone got up from their seats and began to leave, Kim couldn't help but feel really annoyed with Steve because he was just so silent and not invested in this play. And it's like, we came all the way here, why aren't you at least pretending to enjoy this? But Kim also thought, Steve put a ton of effort into this weekend. He's clearly trying. I'm not going to start a fight. I'm not going to bring it up. And so finally, Kim just said to Steve, "Hey, why don't we go to the bar and get a couple of drinks, bring them back to our cottage, and just hang out there for the night?" And when Steve heard this, he actually smiled and said, "Okay, great, let's do it." And by the time the couple got back to the front door of cottage 506, they were holding hands again and laughing and telling stories, and they went inside and Steve put the beers down on the table, and then Kim said she was going to go in the bedroom and just quickly change into something more comfortable. And so Kim walked into the bedroom and shut the door, and Steve walked to the front door and turned the lock. Hey everybody, if you've not heard by now, last week we made a major announcement. Our flagship podcast, MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, that pretty much immediately rocketed to the top of the charts when we launched in 2022, and then quickly was scooped up by Amazon by the end of the same year. Yeah, that show, our top show, is now available everywhere. It is no longer just on Amazon Music, it's on all platforms, and it's free. Which means if you've not listened to this podcast since it went exclusive with Amazon Music back in November of 2022, then that means you have about 100 news stories that are only on the podcast that are only now being made available to everybody. So go binge them. And if you signed up for Amazon Music just for this podcast, I love you. Thank you so much. But most importantly, there are still going to be perks for you if you continue to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music. Prime members will get to listen to the MrBallen podcast 30 days earlier than everybody else, and Prime members will get to listen to the podcast on Amazon Music with no ads. But again, the MrBallen podcast is now available worldwide on every podcast platform, and it's totally free. So please, if you would, go find the MrBallen podcast on your choice podcast platform, whether that's Amazon Music or Spotify or Apple or whatever. Give us a follow, listen to an episode, and then please rate the podcast and leave a review. It does an enormous amount for the growth of the show. I'd really appreciate it. All right, back to the stories. Three hours later, a man named Philip Parker, who was staying at the resort with his family, heard a commotion in the lobby, and he heard people saying there might be a fire at cottage 506 and there could be somebody still inside. Philip immediately turned to his cousin who was with him, and the two of them bolted outside and just started running towards cottage 506. And as soon as they got to a place where they could see the cottage from a distance, they could see black, oily smoke pouring out of the windows. When they got up to the burning cottage, Philip ran to the front door, but it was locked. He couldn't get inside. He screamed to see if anybody was in there, but there was no answer. And so Philip and the cousin ran around to the back of the cottage where there was a glass sliding door, and Philip, he tried the handle, but it was locked. At this point, the cousin said he was going to run back to the resort and get a fire extinguisher, and after the cousin ran off, Philip turned back towards the sliding glass door and realized it actually opened on both ends, and he had only checked one side and found that side to be locked, but on the other side, which he was now noticing, it was obviously unlocked because it was open just barely. And so Philip immediately opened it up and all the smoke began coming out, and so Philip dropped down to get a better look because down low the smoke had not fully settled. There was a bit of an air pocket right at the bottom of the floor, and so Philip got down and he looked inside, and for a second he couldn't quite see anything, but then he noticed in the middle of the bedroom, right inside this cottage, he could clearly see somebody's feet. Somebody was on the ground. And so Philip screamed that he was coming in, and then he opened the door the rest of the way, and he began low crawling into the bedroom. And as he did, he was hacking and coughing from all the smoke. And so finally, Philip reached this person, and he grabbed their foot, and he shook them to try to wake them up. But they weren't moving. But the fire was getting bigger and stronger. The smoke was getting thicker. Philip was really starting to panic and was worried that he too would get trapped in here. And so he just grabbed this person's leg and began pulling them. And it was really hard, but he finally got this person back to the door. He couldn't quite get them over that lip of where the sliding door was. But right then, Philip's cousin showed up, and the two of them were able to grab this person and get them out of the cottage. And this was the moment when Philip finally got a look at the person he was just dragging out, and it was immediately clear to him that this person was deceased. Their face was basically gone. It was completely burned away. In the days and weeks leading up to this weekend, Steve really was taking secret phone calls and writing notes down in his journal because he was planning something very special. But he was not the only one with plans for this weekend. Here's what police say happened after Kim and Steve got back to their cottage following the show, and Kim went into the bedroom to change, and Steve went to the front door and locked it. A couple of minutes later, Kim came out of the bedroom wearing something sexy, and she looked at Steve and smiled and said, "Come on, get in bed. I'll join you in a second." And so Steve's like, "Great, my plan is working. We're gonna reconnect here." He climbed in bed and he laid down. Then Kim, she walked over and got something out of her bag, and then she walked back over to the bed and she pulled out a syringe and she stabbed it into Steve before he could do anything, and she injected him with something called succinylcholine. Kim had access to this drug from her job as a surgical tech. Succinylcholine is used to relax people's muscles during surgery, but if you give someone too big a dose, it can stop their breathing. And this drug works pretty much instantly, which means Steve would have seen his wife stab him with that syringe, but then instantly he would have been totally paralyzed, but fully awake and fully alive. And so as he was laying there, he would have seen his wife put the syringe down and then grabbed lighter fluid and then walked over to him and calmly poured the lighter fluid all over Steve's face and chest. And then one of Steve's final images he likely saw before his lungs stopped working and he died was his wife striking a match and lighting him on fire. After lighting Steve on fire, Kim casually walked out the back sliding door. She shut it, leaving it open just a crack, and then she made her way to the resort lobby where she put on this big act about how her cottage was on fire and she thinks her husband was still inside. And Philip overheard Kim say that her husband might be inside the cottage, which is when he and his cousin jumped into action. They ran to the cottage and ultimately found Steve deceased inside of the cottage. Ultimately, Kim never intended to give Steve a second chance in their marriage. She was already having an affair with a much younger man who was in the Marines, and she was just done with Steve. And so as Steve began telling his friends and family how he was going to make a huge effort to save his marriage, Kim was going around to her friends and literally openly talking about how she wanted to murder her husband. But nobody took her seriously. They thought she was just kind of venting and being kind of dramatic. But as soon as the news broke that Steve had died in this fire and Kim had not, people rushed to the police to tell them, pretty sure Kim had something to do with this. Kim was convicted of her husband's murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. It would turn out the primary reason why Steve was so secretive before going on this trip was he really wanted it to be this unbelievably special, romantic, kind of like recreation of the couple's first date. And so what he was doing is he was calling all of Kim's friends and family members and asking them questions about things Kim liked because he wanted to incorporate all of her interests in this trip. And then after these calls, when Steve was writing in his journal, that was not just writing down like logistics of the trip. He was also writing down how much he loved Kim and how excited he was for their future and what they would build together as a family. I mean, Steve really believed they were on a path to reconciliation. But of course, that just was not the case. This past week, we dropped a brand new merch line to commemorate Valentine's Day 2024, and people are loving it. Our designers put together, in my opinion, one of the very best graphics we've ever put on any merchandise, and it's right here. So this is the hoodie. This is the back of the hoodie. I think that's just an amazing design. And then the front of the hoodie, it just says Valentine's Day, and the t-shirt has the same design setup as well. But the deal with this merch is it's only available to be purchased for a very short amount of time. And so you have now until Wednesday, February 21st, so just a couple of days from now, that is the last day you can pick up your official Valentine's Day 2024 merchandise. All you have to do is go to shopmrballen.com and you can buy your Valentine's Day merch, or you can also check out the Ballin Basics line, which is our, everyday merchandise we sell year round. So again, shopmrballen.com. Enjoy. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, which has hundreds of stories, a lot like this one, but many of them are only on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts for free, or you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Today, I'm going to tell you two stories about people who basically unknowingly risked everything just to travel to their dream locations. And they didn't realize they were in danger until it was already too late. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please promise the like button a luxurious trip to Paris, but don't tell them you're sending them to Paris, Texas. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of Monday, January 7th, 1985, a 31-year-old man arrived at an international airport in order to board his flight to the United States. The man was very nervous. His heart was beating fast and his palms were sweating so much that he could barely hold the handles of his very heavy, tan-colored suitcase. And the reason he was so nervous is because he was feeling very conflicted about what he was about to do. On the one hand, this trip was something he'd been dreaming of for months, and it was supposed to represent the start of a great brand new life. Now, this man hadn't actually packed very many personal items to take with him. But one thing he had brought was a little bound book full of photographs, which showed what mattered the most to him. And what mattered the most was waiting for him in America. But on the other hand, the man was terrified, because before he could begin this brand new life, he had a huge problem he needed to take care of. And that problem was why he needed to drop off his very heavy suitcase without anybody looking inside of it. And so now, inside the airport, the very nervous man stopped and readjusted his grip on the suitcase handles, and then made his way over to the ticketing area, where he would check his bag for his almost 11-hour flight to California. And then, once he touched down and they landed in California, he could get off the plane, go to the baggage carousel, and get his luggage, and then everything would be fine. Now, of course, he knew this was a big gamble. If it had been possible, he would have just brought this bag with him on the plane to stow it in the overhead bin, but he just couldn't do it because the bag was too big, too heavy. And so really his only other choice, if he wanted the suitcase to make it to California, was to check it like he was doing, because the alternative was leaving it behind, and there was no way he was going to do that. He cared far too much about what was inside of this luggage. And so by the time the man actually got in line in the ticketing and baggage check area, he was so stressed out that he was beginning to feel physically ill. By the time he got to the front of the line, he still felt very sick, but he composed himself enough that he walked up to the counter of the airline he was traveling with, which was Lufthansa Airline, and the employee who was working behind the counter was very cheerful, and they greeted the man and took his passport to verify his information. Then the employee put down the passport and then reached out his hand and gestured for the nervous man to give him his very important suitcase. This was, of course, the moment the man had feared the most, when everything could really go astray. But as calm as he could, he lifted up the suitcase, and for a second he almost panicked because it was just so obviously heavy. He realized the employee might make him open it right there because it just seemed wrong that this suitcase was that heavy. And he knew if that happened, he was done for. He'd be arrested immediately. But instead, the employee just dragged the heavy suitcase over to a conveyor belt behind the counter, and the nervous man watched as the employee heaved the suitcase onto the belt, and the man kept his eyes locked on the suitcase as it rolled down the belt and then disappeared through a pair of rubber flaps at the very end. He was so focused on the bag, he almost didn't notice the airline employee returning to try to hand him his boarding pass for the plane. Finally, the employee literally just waved the ticket in the man's face to get his attention, and it kind of snapped him out of it, and he took the boarding pass, and as calmly as he could, he thanked the employee, and then he turned and hurried off to catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, another employee of Lufthansa Airlines walked around the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, which is typically just called LAX. It was about 2 p.m. Los Angeles time, and the employee was working in the international terminal. It was his job to monitor the circular carousels where passengers picked up their luggage after their flights, and his job was to make sure no bags were left behind. And as he was making one of these loops, he noticed there was a tan-colored suitcase with soft sides sitting all alone on one of the carousels. The employee stopped and checked the monitor above the carousel to see the last time this carousel had been used by an incoming plane, and it was quite a while ago. and all the passengers clearly had come through and picked up their luggage, except for this one lone bag. So, based on the timing, the employee figured that, well, this bag must be unclaimed. But this was not remotely concerning to him. I mean, luggage went unclaimed all the time. Sometimes because bags were sent to the wrong airport, or because the suitcase's owner missed their flight, or even just forgot to get it. But whatever the reason was, it was this employee's job to simply start the process of identifying the owner of the suitcase. So, like he always did, he walked over to the carousel and grabbed the suitcase handle and went to pick it up. But when he did, he let out a sort of surprised grunt and stumbled, because the suitcase was so much heavier than he had expected. So he went back and he grabbed the handle with a better grip this time with two hands, and braced himself and yanked, and the suitcase kind of toppled over and fell off the carousel onto the floor. And this was also around the time that the employee noticed that this really heavy suitcase had no tags on it. And so now this bag did seem very unusual. The extreme weight and no tags, like, that's not normal. So he knelt down and he began to unzip the suitcase to see what was inside. He was legally allowed to do this because unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search. But he had only unzipped it a little bit before he froze, and for a second he just stared in shock at what was inside of the suitcase. But then he immediately got to his feet, just left the bag there, and ran to go find a phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, around 3:45 p.m., Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in the baggage area of LAX's International Terminal, looking down grimly into the tan suitcase that was lying open on the floor. He was surrounded by officials from the LAPD, as well as the FBI, who had all been called to the airport because of what was found inside of the suitcase: the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was shocked. He guessed this woman was maybe less than 30 years old, and judging by her features and dark hair, he thought she could be from an Asian or Latin American country. But that was about as far as he could get, since she didn't have any identification with her, and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, so he couldn't immediately tell how she died. Raven spent some time speaking to airline and airport employees, including Customs, which is the government agency that's in charge of inspecting bags that are coming in and out of the country. And he was puzzled as to how a suitcase with a body inside of it had somehow cleared customs, but an agent explained that they didn't actually open up all the suitcases, which meant whoever checked this bag through customs had taken a huge risk, because realistically, they could have been searched and then the body would have been found. So this suggested a certain level of desperation, but apparently this risk this person took to check the bag had paid off because the bag had gone all the way to California. But despite that, Ravens didn't find much to go on here. At this moment, the victim was a Jane Doe, which meant there was no identification for her. And Ravens knew she could really be from anywhere in the world, despite, his snap judgment that perhaps she was from an Asian or Latin American country. And because LAX was an international airport, whoever checked this bag and potentially even put her into the suitcase could now be anywhere in the world too. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators had finished examining the body as it was found inside of the suitcase, they didn't actually pull her body out. They sent the suitcase and her body to the coroner. Hopefully, an autopsy would turn up evidence that could tell Ravens and the other investigators who this Jane Doe was and what happened to her. The following day, on Tuesday, Ravens sat down at his desk and he opened up a manila folder he had been given. Inside of it was his Jane Doe's autopsy report. And when the detective began reading it, he couldn't help but feel sick, because what he was reading told him that this poor woman had died a horrible, torturous death. The report said the woman had bruises all over her body, like the kind you would get from repeated heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive, and her actual eventual cause of death was ultimately suffocation, which meant she either was suffocated and then put into the suitcase, or was in the suitcase, trapped inside of there, and suffocated. Ravens put down the report and leaned back in his chair and just sort of thought through what he had just learned. Based on the autopsy, he now knew this poor woman had died a brutal, awful death, but the coroner had not found any identifying information or anything on her that would give away or help to give away who she actually was or who did this to her. So really he had very little here other than knowing this lady suffered. Ravens had spent the last 24 hours poring over all the surveillance footage from the airport security cameras, looking for any suspicious passengers leaving without any luggage. But nothing had jumped out at him. He'd also interviewed a bunch of airport employees who would have been in the baggage claim area on the day the body was found, but none of them had noticed anything strange either. And so, despite it only having been one day since this woman was found, Ravens was already worried that this case was going to go cold. But what Ravens had not counted on was the huge amount of publicity his Jane Doe would generate. The TV news, as well as the newspapers, were reporting feverishly on the body that was found in the LAX suitcase. And by Wednesday, so 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had made it all the way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinoza contacted authorities to report that the body might actually belong to his wife. Officials in Peru called the LAPD, and Juan's report ended up on Ravens' desk. Ravens opened up that report and began reading. Juan and his wife lived in Peru's capital city of Lima, but his wife had been trying to leave Peru to escape poverty. She had left their home hoping to basically sneak into the United States so she could get a job there and then send money back to her family in Peru. She had promised Juan that she would contact him when she arrived in America, but after she left, Juan said he never heard from her. This report felt like a promising lead to Ravens. Juan and his wife checked a lot of boxes, especially because, Ravens' Jane Doe had features that indicated she could be from a South American country like Peru. And so Ravens wondered if Juan's wife had tried to get into America by using a human smuggler, which is someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally. Human smuggling was obviously an unregulated industry, and Ravens knew smugglers could be very violent or reckless, and the people they were transporting often had no protection. Meaning, sometimes when people would go to these smugglers to try to get help to go to these other countries, sometimes the smuggler wouldn't help them. They would just rob them, or in some cases, rob them and then kill them and dispose of their body. And unfortunately, again, because there's no regulation or oversight, a lot of times these horrible crimes would just go unnoticed. And so maybe, if that's what had happened to Ravens' Jane Doe, it would explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. The smuggler who, committed this crime would not have wanted to leave any ID on or around the body that could be traced back to them. And so Ravens picked up his phone to call the LAX airport operations manager to see if he could get the logs for any flights coming from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. And that was when he discovered there was a big problem with this theory, because there were no flights from Peru. The only flights that day that used the luggage carousel where the body was found were from Korea, Japan, and Germany. And there weren't any flights that originated in Peru that had layovers in those countries either, which meant it just wasn't possible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And so now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no evidence to go on. All he really had was the suitcase and the body. And the actual crime scene itself was maybe somewhere in Korea or Japan or Germany. And so Ravens really didn't have a good idea of where he should begin looking for more evidence. But then he got an idea. Detective Ravens got up from his desk and headed straight to the evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable gloves, and he found the box that contained evidence from Jane Doe's case, and he opened it up. And there really wasn't much. All that was in there were, pieces of jewelry and some clothing that were found on the woman's body. And all of it had already been examined for trace evidence like blood or hair. However, blood and hair were not what Ravens was looking for. One at a time, he lifted out each of the sealed plastic bags that contained Jane Doe's belongings until he got to her blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and he turned it over in his hands and then checked inside the neckband. And there he found exactly what he was looking for. Immediately, he felt a rush of adrenaline. He was onto something here. And so he reached back into the box and he grabbed another plastic bag with a pair of gray pants in it. And he did the same thing. He looked at the waistband. Then he opened a third bag and he checked inside of her blouse. And each time, his hunch had been right. Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them. And the labels were clearly written in some language that was not English. Ravens wasn't sure, but to him, he thought maybe the letters looked Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of Jane Doe's clothing. All of it had been made in the Middle East, in Iran. This meant that finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. But he also had another problem now. Really, he had the same problem he'd had when he thought his victim was from Peru. And that was that there were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on. And none of them originated in Iran. and there were no connecting flights from Iran that day either. And so Ravens needed the public's help. On Thursday, so 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down with a reporter from the city's newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that's read all over the world. And Raven and this other detective's goal was, to give as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that somebody somewhere would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward. However, that's not really how the interview played out. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged by all the questions he and his partner just couldn't answer. In fact, the last thing he said to the reporter, which ended up getting printed as the sort of last line of the story, the lasting impression, if you will, was, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office and had barely taken off his coat when his phone rang. A police officer from Sacramento, California was on the other line, and he sounded all worked up. He told Ravens that he knew that, the LA investigators had been working on the airport Jane Doe case, and even though it wasn't going anywhere, he knew it was a big deal for them. But he told Ravens that he actually had this unbelievable development in Northern California that was connected to the airport Jane Doe case. He said authorities in Northern California had just found another body. But when Ravens heard this, his first reaction was not excitement that there was new evidence or something. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He needed to find his Jane Doe's name. And so he asked the Sacramento officer, what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase or something? But the Sacramento officer said no. The body belonged to a man, and this guy's name had never even been on police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound, 400 miles away from Raven's Jane Doe. But the officer said that the story they had uncovered behind this new body would likely solve Raven's Jane Doe case. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Ravens. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been found at LAX, a man named Hadi had picked up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi, at the Sacramento airport, which is about 400 miles north of LAX. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who'd been away for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Mahmoud was always very optimistic and fun to be around. But on this day, when Mahmoud got in his car, Hadi immediately noticed that his friend seemed sullen and quiet and just very clearly upset about something. And so Hadi asked him what was wrong. And Mahmoud just said, "Oh, I'm sick with the flu." But to Hadi, Mahmoud did not look very sick. He looked worried and kind of jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive, he kept looking out the windows and out the back of the car, like he was nervous about somebody following them or something. And when they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to bed. And for the next 2 days, Mahmoud continued acting increasingly weird and paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment and said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He also kept looking out the windows of their apartment, but whenever Hadi asked what was wrong, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, so now 3 days after Hadi picked Mahmoud up from the airport, Hadi woke up to the sound of the front door of his apartment opening and then shutting. So it felt way too early for Hadi or Mahmoud to be up, and they also lived in a city where break-ins were unfortunately not uncommon. So the sound of the door opening was enough for Hadi to get out of bed and go make sure everything was okay. But when he got to the door, he did not find an intruder or something. He found Mahmoud in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend, where are you going? But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was simply going out. And so there was really nothing Hadi could do. I mean, he couldn't stop Mahmoud from going out, so he watched his friend leave, and then Hadi went back to bed. But as he was in bed, he had this sick feeling in his stomach that something bad was about to happen. About 2 hours later, somebody called the Sacramento Police Department to report finding a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a parking lot. The dead man had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and on the passenger seat next to the body were 2 Iranian passports and 1 Lufthansa Airlines plane ticket. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens the story, he said he believed that one of the passports that were found in the car with the body belonged to Raven's Jane Doe. He said he would send it over that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive ID. And when the passport did arrive, Ravens was able to finally give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud's apartment, they would find another piece of evidence that would actually explain why Katan Safawi had ended up beaten and pummeled and asphyxiated to death in an abandoned tan suitcase in LAX. The evidence was a little bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on January 7th, 1985, Mahmoud very nervously dropped off the tan suitcase that contained Katan at the international airport and then boarded a Lufthansa flight to LAX. He was traveling from Frankfurt, Germany, one of the 3 cities that had flights into LAX that day that specifically used the carousel where the body was found. But Mahmoud's trip had not started in Frankfurt. It had started in Iran. But his travel plans had gotten all messed up and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days. And so this was him finally getting out. But he was insanely nervous about this leg of the trip because of what was in his suitcase. He had expected to feel much less worried once he had successfully checked the suitcase and got his ticket and boarded his flight. But when he did all that, and when his plane took off, Mahmoud only got more and more anxious. Every time the plane hit even the tiniest amount of turbulence, he wanted to scream from the anxiety. But finally, the flight landed at LAX, and as soon as it touched down, Mahmoud got off as fast as he could and practically sprinted to the baggage carousel where he would pick up his suitcase and then board another flight to Sacramento. But when he got to baggage claim and he picked up his suitcase, he knew immediately something was wrong. With a shaking hand, he unzipped the suitcase. And when he looked inside, he felt a wave of grief and horror that was so powerful he almost fainted right there. Because the trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, that he was returning home from now, was a journey to his home country of Iran to get married to the woman he loved, Katan. And now, inside the suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife, Katan, who Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle into America to start their new life together. Katan had run into issues with her visa in Frankfurt, and officials wouldn't let her board the plane to America. And so Katan and Mahmoud tried for days to fix this problem, but it became clear that only Mahmoud would be able to actually enter the United States, not Katan. And so ultimately, Katan willingly got into that suitcase. Mahmoud had not murdered her, or at least not intentionally so. She hadn't been trafficked or anything. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that they would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane, and that's how they would get her to the United States. But during the flight, when she had boarded, she had been totally alive. But when she was in the cargo hold, other luggage had fallen and piled on top of her and slowly crushed her to death. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened up the suitcase and saw what had happened, he panicked. He pulled the tags off the suitcase and left the suitcase and just got on his flight to Sacramento. And then once he landed there, he was so overcome with guilt and grief that 3 days later, he took his own life. When police searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip to America. And those photos were of his and Katan's wedding. The following week, Mahmoud and Katan's bodies were sent back to Iran via the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles. But this time, they traveled together. On the morning of December 11, 1960, a 27-year-old man named Leonid Rogozov stood on the deck of a Soviet ship that was sailing across a freezing ocean at the very bottom of the world. Up ahead, finally, he could see the enormous, desolate white landmass of Antarctica, a continent that was too brutally cold for human civilization to last at scale. Basically, nobody lived there except for like a handful of scientists and other people who were researching the area, like Leonid. Antarctica was about to be Leonid's home for the next year and a half. And Leonid, he looked around him on the deck of the ship at the other 11 men who made up his team, and he smiled. They were all part of what was called the 6th Soviet Antarctic Expedition, and they'd been sailing for 36 days, all the way from Leningrad, Russia, to get here. Their job was to get to Antarctica, disembark, and then travel nearly 50 miles inland over brutal terrain, where they would eventually build a brand new scientific research facility from the ground up and then they would stay there and begin studying the local climate. Reunited and the rest of the men had been chosen for this expedition because they all had specific skills that the team needed. Reunited was a meteorologist and also knew how to drive this special all-terrain vehicle that they'd brought on the ship. There were a few other meteorologists on the team, as well as several engineers and other scientists, and also one of the men was a doctor. Their work was part of a larger Cold War-era effort by the Soviet government to expand scientific research and knowledge. So Reunited saw this job both as a way of having this big adventure and also as a way of serving his country. And so he ultimately felt proud to be here. But as he was actually looking at the vast emptiness of Antarctica right in front of him for the first time, the reality of the situation they were in began to dawn on him, and he began to feel a jolt of fear. Everything on this expedition had to go exactly right, or he and the other men's lives would be in danger. I mean, this is not a safe place for people. They were arriving in a place with literally zero infrastructure, and they only had about 2 months before the polar winter was going to hit Antarctica, which meant they had to construct the entire research facility and make sure it was polar winter proof in those first 2 months, because that was their shelter. And just to make the stakes clear, if they didn't get it done in time, or if the structure was flawed in some way, they would almost certainly die. When the polar winter came, temperatures would drop as low as negative 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ocean would literally freeze solid. The closest help would be about 1,000 miles away and could take weeks or even months to arrive. And their only way to contact the outside world was with this long-range radio that was not always reliable. So essentially, Reunited and these 11 other men that made up this expedition, they were going to be completely isolated, with nobody to rely on except each other, until their scheduled pickup, which was in April of 1962. Again, a year and a half later. So now, when their ship docked on the coast of Antarctica, and the captain called out for everyone to start unloading the ship, Reunited hesitated, and so did some other men. I mean, this was it. This was the real start. But one at a time, they began grabbing their supplies and climbing down a ramp on the side of the ship. Reunited watched his fellow scientists step onto the snow, and as he did, he sort of shook off his own fear as a moment of weakness. Right now, he needed to be strong. And ultimately, I mean, Reunited was a very strong-willed person. He had been born in a remote village in eastern Siberia, so he knew he could handle the isolation and the extreme cold. He had already done that before. He was also the son of a World War II veteran who had died in combat, and his father had taught him to soldier on at all costs, even under the toughest circumstances. So right now, that's what Reunited did. He soldiered on. He took a deep breath of the ice-cold air, then grabbed his things, walked down the ramp, and stepped onto the snow with the others. And then once they had everything they had packed for the next 16 months off the ship, the crew on board the ship still wished all the men good luck, and then they lifted up the ramp. And then Reunited and the rest of the team watched as that ship began sailing away, leaving them all alone for the first time. At first, things at the new Antarctic Research Center went pretty well. Reunited and the team successfully built the entire research building in time before the polar winter, so when the worst weather came, they were able to hunker down inside and be safe. They'd also set up a whole bunch of atmospheric measurement tools that allowed them to study the Antarctic climate exactly as they wanted to. So by April, so 4 months after getting dropped off by that ship, and now only about a month or so into the 6-month-long polar winter, the men, for the most part, were really just trying to stay warm, conserve their supplies, and gather data. However, they hit their first real snag on the morning of April 29th. Reunited woke up in his bunk that day with a stomachache. When Reunited woke up, he had that pain in his stomach, but he felt nauseous and so weak that he could barely roll over inside of his bed. And this really concerned Reunited, because getting a stomachache back at home was one thing, but getting a stomachache in Antarctica was totally different. For one, there was a huge blizzard going on outside that was making both land and air travel literally impossible, which meant that even if Reunited radioed for help, nobody would be able to get to him for a very long time. And to make matters even worse, at their research station, they didn't have access to most of the regular medical treatments that would have been available back at home. Basically, if this stomachache was anything serious, Reunited could die. As a result, Reunited would basically not allow himself to even consider the possibility that this stomachache was serious. Instead, he told himself that He must have just eaten something weird. They were all living off of rations of preserved food, and so he figured he must have gotten a bad batch of something, and maybe he just had a mild case of food poisoning. So he dragged himself out of bed and he went to the kitchen for a glass of water to hopefully settle his stomach. But when he got there, he saw two other men, another meteorologist and an engineer, who were sitting at a nearby table having breakfast, and they took one look at Leonid and immediately asked him, like, hey, are you okay? And Leonid didn't want to worry them because, again, like any medical emergency is a huge deal here for everybody. So he quickly forced a smile and said, oh yeah, everything's fine. Then Leonid quickly grabbed his glass of water, chugged it down, and made his way back to his bunk. And when he got there, he didn't just climb back in bed. Instead, he grabbed some clean clothes and a towel and then walked down the hallway to the shower stalls. And he turned one on as hot as it would go and then got inside. However, before he could even wash his hair, his vision began to go blurry around the edges and his ears began to ring. He felt like he was about to faint, and he quickly sat down on the floor of the shower so he wouldn't fall and hurt himself. And as he was sitting there with his head spinning and the hot water raining down on him, the dull, aching pain in his stomach suddenly sharpened. It was like a horrible, stabbing pain ripping through his stomach now. Leonid barely had time to wrap a towel around his waist and rush to a toilet before he began to vomit. A few minutes later, Leonid stumbled into a small storage closet where the research team kept a reserve of basic medications like pain relievers and antibiotics. Leonid took some antibiotics and tried to power through the day, but that pain in his abdomen just got more and more intense. Eventually, he told the other men on his team that he really had to stop, lie down, and rest, that something was wrong here, but maybe if he just lays down long enough, it'll go away. Leonid would spend the entire evening going back and forth from his bed to the toilet because he kept vomiting, and he didn't sleep at all that night. And by the next morning, April 30th, Leonid was in so much pain that he really couldn't even try to hide it anymore. He was still vomiting, he was still very dizzy to the point where he could barely stand up, and he could tell he was also running a very high fever. However, what really scared Leonid the most was what his belly actually looked like. He had not been able to keep any food down for the last 24 hours, so he knew his stomach was completely empty, and yet he was so bloated that his belly was sticking out like a balloon. And so lying in bed, feeling feverish, nauseous, and dizzy, and looking down at his grotesquely swollen abdomen, Leonid had to admit to himself that this was definitely more than just food poisoning. Something was very wrong, and he needed help. The scientific research team's doctor took stock of all of Leonid's symptoms, and he immediately came up with a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was simple, but the treatment was not. Leonid definitely did not have food poisoning. He was in a life or death situation. This was a very serious thing. But to save him, the doctor was going to have to perform a surgery that had only ever been done successfully 2 times in all of history. And that was because this surgery required a very risky technique that most doctors refused to even try because it was so dangerous, both to the patient and also to the doctor. Basically, Leonid was likely going to die if the doctor attempted the surgery, but Leonid was definitely going to die if he didn't. And so ultimately, a decision was made that the doctor would give it his best try. At least that way, they were trying to save Leonid's life, even if they were unsuccessful. At 2 a.m. that night, so technically early morning on May 1st, the doctor took a deep breath and mentally prepared themselves for this surgery. Leonid was lying on a makeshift operating table inside the research center. He was wearing a surgical gown, and despite the fact he was about to undergo real surgery here, he was wide awake because he had to be. Due to the nature of this incredibly risky and rare surgery, the doctor couldn't actually give Leonid any real anesthesia to knock him out. Leonid had to be wide awake and fully aware for this entire procedure, which meant all he could get were some local anesthetics, which sort of dulled the pain but did not get rid of it. The doctor looked over at the 4 other research team members who were in the operating room. There was a driver, a meteorologist, and 2 aerologists, which are scientists who study the Earth's atmosphere. Now, none of these 4 had any real medical training, but the doctor needed assistance to do this operation, so he'd recruited them to help him out. Leonid had his head propped up with pillows, and his knees were turned to the left, so he was twisted into a position where the lower right side of his abdomen was facing up towards the ceiling. The doctor had already cut a hole in his hospital gown, so Leonid's swollen stomach was visible. And now, through that hole, the doctor injected Novocaine, which is a type of local anesthetic, right into Leonid's abdomen. And then once the Novocaine took effect, the doctor used a scalpel to carefully make a 4-inch-long incision into Leonid's lower abdomen. Leonid took in a sharp breath, but he did his best to stay perfectly still. The incision began to bleed heavily, and one of the assistants came over and used a pair of metal tongs to spread open Leonid's skin and muscles and fat, revealing Leonid's internal organs. At this point, the doctor was so nervous that his hands began to shake, but he took a deep breath and slowly cut his way with the scalpel through the protective membrane that surrounded Leonid's organs. But as he did, he accidentally poked a hole in Leonid's large intestine, and Leonid noticed right away because he began gushing blood. And when the doctor realized what he'd done, he sort of began to panic, and he began yelling for the assistants to hand him his surgical sewing kit. And when they did, he kind of clumsily began trying to sew the hole shut. But by the time the doctor had finally closed up the wound, Leonid had already lost a lot of blood. And the real problem, the reason the doctor was doing this surgery in the first place, still had not been solved. Like, the surgery had not really even happened. We just had this incision, that's it. And so the doctor knew he really had to hurry before Leonid bled out. And so he threw his standard operating procedures out the window. He just had to go for it here. So he just took one of his hands and reached inside of Leonid's abdominal cavity and started literally feeling around, trying to find the source of Leonid's illness. But as he did, it was like all the blood drained out of Leonid's face. I mean, he's feeling this. This must have been horrific. His body went limp and his head kind of rolled back on his pillow. And this was actually the exact moment that this surgery truly became its most dangerous. Not just for Leonid, but for the doctor too. Right as Leonid's head rolled backwards, the doctor felt himself go weak, and suddenly he was seeing stars. And this was because Leonid and the doctor were actually the same person. In addition to being a meteorologist and a driver of that special vehicle, Leonid was also a recent medical school graduate, and he was the one doctor at this research station. So Leonid was performing surgery on himself. He had given himself that Novocaine shot, and then forced himself to stay still as he carved a 4-inch-long incision into his own abdomen, accidentally slicing into his intestines that he had the wherewithal to then stitch up as he's bleeding to death, and then he shoved his own hand into his abdominal cavity. But it was at that point that Leonid actually looked like he might die, because he began to show signs like he was going to pass out, likely from blood loss or just shock. But he'd given his assistants specific instruction on what to do if he passed out during the procedure. They were supposed to inject him with a specific drug mixture and then give him CPR until he woke up. But just as one of the assistants readied the needle to inject into Leonid because it did appear like he was about to pass out, Leonid suddenly sucked in a huge breath and his head snapped back up. Leonid, with his hand still inside of his abdomen, told his assistants that he was okay. Then he looked over at the mirror that one of his assistants had been holding up this whole time so that he could see what he was doing during the surgery. And with a combination of the mirror and just sort of feeling around inside of his own body, which must have been horrifically painful, Leonid finally found the thing that was making him so sick. It was his appendix. This entire time, Leonid had been suffering from acute appendicitis. Then he cleaned out his abdominal cavity with antibiotics and then sutured up the entire incision. When he was finally all done, Leonid examined his appendix that he had cut out of himself, and he saw there was this dark, diseased-looking spot right on the bottom of it. Leonid estimated that if he had not removed this thing, it very likely would have burst in less than 24 hours, and that definitely would have killed him. Within just 2 weeks, Leonid was back up on his feet and helping out at the research center like normal. And when the whole team went back home to the Soviet Union in April of 1962, so about a year after Leonid's self-surgery, he was greeted like a hero. The government actually gave him a medal called the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, which was for extraordinary contributions to Soviet society. And he would go down in history as the third person to ever perform a successful auto-appendectomy, and he did it outside of a real hospital with no other trained medical professionals anywhere nearby. And that's actually not the only way that Leonid's legacy lived on. Today, some countries actually require doctors who are stationed in Antarctica to undergo preventative appendectomies, just so that they will never be in a situation like Leonid. Because it turns out, the one thing you really can't bring to Antarctica is your appendix. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about missing people. Except the real take-home from each of these stories is not so much how or why these people went missing, but instead, it's the haunting circumstances surrounding each of their disappearances. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to fill up the like button's car with gas. But instead of actually doing that, just go ahead and permanently glue shut their gas cap. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of April 10th, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern in the small town of Hudson, Florida. Diane grabbed her glass off the bar and downed the last few sips of her drink, and even though by this point her vision was blurry and she actually felt sick to her stomach, she still yelled out to the bartender in a very slurred voice and told him to bring her another round. And the reason for this is because Diane actively wanted to get so drunk that she could just forget everything. Because at the moment, her life was kind of a disaster. So Diane used to be a married, stay-at-home mother with 3 kids that she loved so much, but about 10 years ago, she'd begun having some very serious mental health problems, and she'd ultimately been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She would fall into these deep depressions that would make it almost impossible to function. And then she would swing and have these manic episodes that would literally keep her up for days on end and left her so delirious that she would start talking to herself. Eventually, Diane's husband divorced her, and he got custody of their kids. Now, Diane's life had sort of leveled off. She was living with her sister, so she had some level of support, but her bipolar disorder really was not under control. In part because she had medication for it, but didn't always take it. And so she would swing in and out of mania and deep depressions all over again. And as a result of this, she had consistently been in and out of various psychiatric facilities multiple times. So on this particular night, Diane really just wanted to drown her sorrows. And so a couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house and walked to this bar because she didn't have a car. And she'd been standing around at this bar, basically pacing in circles and drinking alone ever since. Just then, the bartender came over. And even though Diane was seeing double, she immediately saw that he did not have another round in his hand. He had no more alcohol. The bartender gave Diane a look that was half annoyed and half sympathetic. And he told her he was cutting her off. And Diane was so mad. She began telling him that he didn't know what he was talking about, that this was humiliating, but he just put his hands up and said, "No, I'm sorry, you're cut off." And so eventually, very angrily, Diane turned and sort of stumbled out of the bar and began walking down the street. The next day, so April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, paced back and forth inside of her living room, holding a phone to her ear. It rang a couple of times, and then a dispatcher from the local police department picked up. At which point, Mildred told them in a shaky voice that she needed to report her daughter, Diane, missing. So a little while earlier, Mildred's other daughter, Diane's sister, the one that Diane lived with, had called to tell her that Diane had left the house the night before without telling her where she was going and still had not come home yet. And of course, based on Diane's history of mental illness and pretty erratic behavior, Mildred immediately felt like, oh my gosh, my daughter must be in trouble. So now, on the phone with police dispatch, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that her daughter, Diane, had left and gone somewhere for some actual real purpose, but it was also entirely possible that she was having a manic episode and might have, in her mania, wandered off and gotten lost. The dispatcher said that she would send officers to interview Mildred and her other daughter, and they would start looking for Diane right away. But 4 days later, on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Diane's mother, Mildred, checked in at the police station, like she had been every day since her daughter first went missing. But, just like always, the police didn't have any new information for her. So far, all they knew was on April 10th, the night Diane had left her sister's house without saying where she was going, they had figured out she had gone to the Hayloft Tavern and gotten so unbelievably drunk that the bartender had cut her off. And then at that point, she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last the bartender saw her. The following day, on April 11th, Diane had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from that tavern. And then she'd also been spotted near a locally owned motel right off the highway called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the police said they had no idea what happened to Diane, where she could have gone, or what could have happened to her. And so ultimately, Mildred left the police station feeling very disappointed and also scared. I mean, the whole drive back to her home, she felt absolutely sick with worry. She had no idea if her daughter was hiding somewhere on purpose, or if she'd gotten lost and was now injured, or maybe she was hungry, or if she'd maybe run into the wrong person and potentially been kidnapped, or worse. I mean, there's all these terrible scenarios playing out in her head. Finally, Mildred got back home and she went inside and she sat down on her couch and just tried to think about, what else she could do to find her daughter. And that's when she noticed she had a new voicemail on her answering machine. Mildred thought, maybe her other daughter had called while she was out and that was the voicemail. Or maybe it's something to do with Diane. But either way, she got up, she walked over, and she hit play. And what she heard made her feel sick to her stomach. What she heard was Diane's voice. And Diane sounded terrified. And she kept saying, "Help! Let me out!" Then there was sort of a scuffling sound on the recording, like somebody had grabbed the phone out of Diane's hand. And then Diane said something like, "Hey, give me that." And then the call just cut off. And so after hearing this, Mildred obviously went into a total panic. It's like, oh my gosh, all of the worst things that could have happened to my daughter must be happening. And so now, even though Mildred was completely upset, she's shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked for the caller ID to see, who left this message. But all it said was the call had come in from somewhere called Starlight, which didn't mean anything to Mildred. But she quickly, dialed this number back, hoping, whoever it was would pick up, but nobody answered. And so after that, Mildred called the police. This voicemail made it obvious to police that Diane had not left on purpose and she was not lost. It sounded like, at least based on this voicemail, that she had been kidnapped and was likely being held against her will. But as for where Diane was being held, the police had no idea. They couldn't trace the call to her specific location, and they couldn't figure out what this Starlight thing was either. So for another full day or so, the investigation, despite this new lead, basically floundered. There wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon, on April 16th, so 5 days after Diane disappeared. On that day, the police got a call from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19 and he had found something disturbing. He said he wasn't sure if the object was even real, but he thought, for sure the police should probably come check it out just in case. And so police immediately rushed out to the scene. They found this object, they sent it off for testing, and then they waited. And when the analysis came back, they learned two things. Number one, the object was definitely real. And number two, it belonged to Diane Auget. The object was the severed tip of a finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, people kept calling in sightings of Diane Auget to the police in Florida. And the police would look into it, and they would interview more than 100 people. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, which is where that voicemail had originated from that was left on her mother's voicemail. And the police also never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off. But despite all that, strange clues that definitely were tied to Diane kept turning up in some very strange places. Like, for example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a bag of Diane's neatly folded clothing inside of their store's outdoor freezer. And a customer at a different nearby convenience store found a plastic bag full of toiletries, including eyeliner and perfume and lipstick, that was left behind on a countertop. And on it was scrawled the name Diane. But police were never able to figure out who placed the bag or why. And so unfortunately, today, BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Sometimes I think about being a kid, riding in the back seat at night, street lights flashing across the window, no responsibilities, no real fear of the future. Well, if I could say something to that little kid version of me, I'd probably say, you're gonna be okay, but don't rush it, don't wish this away. Because when things get hard, it's easy to start looking backwards. Nostalgia is basically a highlight reel. And then you look at your present and it doesn't stand a chance. Here's the thing though, the life you are living right now, you're going to feel nostalgic for this someday. And so if you spend it longing for something that's already gone, you'll miss it twice. If reaching for the past is getting in the way of living now, therapy may help you figure out what you're actually looking for. And it might also help you to start finding more of that in the present. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. And switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Around 3:30 p.m. on December 17, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside of a U.S. Navy submarine that was cruising underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the front of the submarine, inside of a small windowless compartment called the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long by 10 feet wide, and on one side, there was a metal door that was open that led out to the rest of the submarine. The walls were lined with 6 bunks, a bunch of machinery, and also several torpedoes. And Joe was absolutely thrilled to be in this submarine, because Joe had always dreamed of working on a sub. When he was a kid, he'd actually made this fake periscope out of wood, which on a submarine, the periscope is like a set of binoculars, if you will, that kind of juts up above the submarine, and the submarine can rise just close to the surface, but right below, and the periscope perches kind of just barely out of the water, and it can look around to show you what else is nearby. And so with this fake periscope, Joe and his older sister Florence would spend hours and hours as kids pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater on all sorts of special missions. And so years later, when Joe turned 18, the first thing he did is he enlisted in the Navy. And recently, he had finally been assigned to actually working on this submarine. And it was really like, his childhood dream had finally come true. On this particular day, Joe was doing one of his very first test sails. Basically, he and the other 40 men on board the sub were just testing out all the different machinery on board to make sure everything was working correctly. And so Joe and 5 other men had been assigned specifically to work in the torpedo room. They stood by inside of this room and waited for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom overhead. But as they're standing there, just sort of waiting around, sort of out of nowhere, Joe heard this grating, loud, metallic sound that kind of echoed through the whole submarine. In fact, the sub itself shook so hard during the sound that Joe and the others fell to the ground. And so immediately, Joe and his coworkers are scrambling to get to their feet. They're looking at each other like, what was that? But then it was like their worst nightmare began to play out, as water began to rush through that open door from the rest of the submarine into the torpedo room. And so as this absolutely horrifying scenario is playing out, Joe, his immediate reaction is actually this overwhelming sense of deja vu. Like just for a second, he felt like, I've experienced this exact moment before. But before he could actually process this feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him and managed to slam that door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine. They shut it and they sealed it. And so at this point, Joe has sort of snapped back to reality. He's not thinking about the deja vu thing. He's like, okay, what's going on? I mean, he realized there must have clearly been some kind of accident. I mean, basically everybody thought the same thing. That sound, the grating sound, the shaking in the water, I mean, that screams something has struck the torpedo, something's happened. He expected the captain's voice to come over the intercom, not to talk about the test run they were actually on here, but with orders about what they should do now that there was a real-world emergency playing out. And so for a couple of minutes, Joe and his fellow sailors just kind of sat there in this, sealed-off torpedo room waiting for this announcement. But there was nothing. And then Joe and the others felt a jolt, as if the submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. Whatever had happened, they knew clearly it was not good, but they also figured, maybe this was not a total emergency. It was bad, but maybe we can salvage this. After all, they were only about, 1 mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room did not have a way to actually reach out from where they were to the Coast Guard station, or anyone else for that matter, to call for help, they figured that somebody else in the other parts of the submarine would be able to punch out and call to the Coast Guard station and call for help. But the minutes turned into hours, and there was no progress. There was no obvious sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They didn't hear anything over the intercom. They couldn't even hear anything on the other side of the door. They figured by now one of their comrades would have come over and knocked on the door or in some way talked to them. But no, it's just silence. And also the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered out. They're very likely on the bottom of the bay in this sealed room in total darkness. They also had no food and no water. That was in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't open the door without risking more water coming in. So they're just totally trapped. Now, of course, all of that was horrible. For Joe and the others, they knew how dire this situation was. But the scariest part of the whole situation was that they knew there was a finite amount of oxygen inside of this sealed room. And with every breath they took in, they were using up that air supply. And so pretty soon, this tiny metal torpedo room was starting to feel more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He sort of lost track of time, and he also was starting to lose hope. But then suddenly, Joe heard this loud, metallic clanging sound. And he realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine, like their rescue had clearly begun. And so Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunk, sort of knocking into each other because they can't see each other, and they went over to begin knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that, hey, we're alive, we're still in here. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication via tapping, Joe was able to actually communicate with these folks outside the submarine. And he did confirm they were Coast Guard rescue divers, and they told Joe what happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had struck their submarine, it punctured the submarine, it sank, and everybody else, minus Joe and his people inside of the torpedo room, had all drowned. And so now the rescue divers were here to rescue Joe and the other people he was with. Now, when Joe and the others heard this news, this was horrifying, but also they're thinking, wow, had we not sealed that door as fast as we had, we would be dead. We are so lucky to be alive. And so Joe, after hearing this message, he began frantically knocking back a message, basically saying well, great, but when are you gonna get us out of here? Because we're running out of air. It's getting hard to breathe in here. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best and they would get them up as soon as possible. And this was definitely true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could as quickly as they could to save Joe and the others. But the reality was, this was a really difficult problem to solve. You have people that are trapped inside of an air pocket deep underwater. If you open up any section of this air pocket, any section of the submarine, water will rush in so quickly that the pressure alone of that water rushing in would literally kill everybody inside. So that wasn't an option. You also have the fact that, as Joe said, they're running out of air. You have this compressed timeline to figure it out. And so really what it leaves you with is, okay, you need to basically quickly lift up the submarine, keeping everybody inside of it, and raise it to the surface. But this is in 1927. This is a complicated thing to do with modern day technology, let alone 100 years ago. But that was sort of their best chance, is bring in multiple ships with all these different strange lifts and somehow scoop the submarine and raise it to the surface before everybody inside suffocated. But the problem was, when they actually began organizing all these ships to try to lift up the submarine, there was this huge storm on the surface with really high winds that just battered the area, making it nearly impossible to position the different lifts off these ships. And unfortunately, this storm was going to be raging for days. And so while this catastrophe was playing off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper and read yet another article about the sunken submarine, where she knew her brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspaper, desperate to hear or read some good news. But every article and every news segment, they said the same thing. The 6 men who were trapped inside the sub were definitely still alive. They were communicating with the divers, but the storm on the surface was still just too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and not just because the situation itself was objectively dangerous, but also because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. And more specifically, she remembered the very last time they had ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old, and the two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope, and he turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to clarify and explain what he meant, but he had refused. And in fact, after this, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about this in years, but now that she's seeing what's happening with her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, so 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received word that her brother Joe and all the other sailors in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. And Florence was totally grief-stricken. I mean, this was her baby brother who's just died in this horrible way. But also, strangely, for like the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years earlier when he was 4 years old, when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." This is an expression that's used in the Navy to mean everybody on board died, meaning their make-believe submarine had just sunk and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence tried to get, 4-year-old Joe to explain what he meant, but he wouldn't, and then he refused to play it ever again. And so now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother had predicted his own death. On the evening of April 19, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, watching some TV when his phone rang. Thomas picked up and said hello, and he heard his daughter, Patricia, on the other end. And right away, he could tell by Patricia's voice that she was feeling really down, which actually didn't surprise him. So Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she'd really been struggling lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from Pittsburgh in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. Now, she liked her job, mostly because she loved the animals, but she just had a really hard time getting along with people, and so she was sort of lonely. She didn't really have a lot of close friends, and recently she'd been through a breakup, and even though she'd always loved kids, she'd never had any of her own. And so to Thomas, it seemed like his daughter was just going through, basically a midlife crisis. And so as Thomas is listening to his daughter, just kind of, talking about her life generally and just sort of making small talk, he sort of cut through and just said, hey, what's going on? Like, how are you doing? And Patricia, she stopped and then sort of vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress and that she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. And she actually asked her dad if he'd be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh and maybe moving back in with him. And Thomas, who adored his daughter and really felt for her, immediately was like, of course, you can come home anytime you want. This definitely lightened Patricia's mood. And then she told her dad that she'd call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him and she hung up. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter again. The following day, so April 20th at about 8:15 p.m., 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh, a woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated 2-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside, and all Carol could see was the one car driving in front of her. And beyond that, it was just big empty fields on either side of the highway. But, sort of out of nowhere, this car, which had just been putting along at the same speed as Carol, it suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just so confused, like what caused the car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her was another car driving the wrong way, barreling down on her. And so Carol, she jammed on the brakes and she tried to swerve out of the way, same as this other car had. But she wasn't fast enough, and this other car smashed into her, basically head on. Carol felt her head snap back, there was this loud metallic crunching sound, and then blackness. But then just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes and realized she had survived the crash. I mean, she felt, pain in her neck, and her car's a mess, the airbags have deployed, like obviously she's been in a serious wreck, but she's alive. And so eventually, Carol managed to open up her door and she climbed out, with the intention of actually checking on the other driver, because the other car that smashed into her is basically butted up against her and she can't really tell the status of this person. So she gets out and she's going over to see if this person's okay. But before she reached the other car, the other driver also climbed out of their car, and in the light from both cars' headlights, Carol could see that this other person was a middle-aged woman who appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, didn't appear to be hurt, at least on the surface. In fact, weirdly, she seemed very, very calm. And this woman, she just stood there by her car, not saying a word to Carol or in any way recognizing what she had just done, which is drive the wrong way and smash into Carol, could have killed Carol. No recognition of that. Instead, she just stood there, and then eventually she turned and just stared at Carol. And this was sort of alarming to Carol, and it caused her to just stop and also just stand there staring at this woman, not really sure what to do. And as Carol is waiting to see what they're gonna do, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, just turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled to her to stop, you can't go. We had this horrible accident, we have to wait for authorities to get here. You can't just leave. But this woman, she didn't even look back to talk to Carol. She just calmly walked off the highway and then climbed over a fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She just vanished. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the wreck and they found Carol, and this other driver again was just gone. And so they ran the license plate of the other car, the one that hit Carol's, and they learned that it was registered to 37-year-old Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that apparently Patricia had just wandered off here, the other weird thing about this was the registration showed that Patricia lived 400 miles away. So they really weren't sure what she was even doing all the way out here. Now, Patricia did not come back to the crash site, and so eventually police got canine units out there and they began looking for her. And they were able to find a trail of her footprints out in that field. And they followed that trail for hours and hours, but eventually the footprints just stopped and the dogs lost her scent. Now, police would continue looking for Patricia for nearly a week with no luck. I mean, they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she wandered into that field and just sort of vanished. But that was not the end of the story. Because about 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Laverne, Minnesota, which was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, they'd actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance and seen pictures of her, because her case was now national news. So when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth by herself, silently drinking water and just staring off into space, he immediately recognized her as Patricia. Now, the police officer had no idea if this really was Patricia. He was confident it was, but this just seems so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if this person was alone or not, or what she was even trying to do. So instead of getting up and going and talking to her, he just stayed in his seat and kept an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, The woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth, slowly drinking water, just staring off into space for 5 hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed, at which point an employee had to tell this woman to get up and go. They also told the officer that he too had to leave. And so after the officer and this woman who he thought was Patricia had left this restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued watching the woman, and she just went right across the street to a diner. And this time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, and he went right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her, and he just said, "What's your name?" And for a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused why, this random police officer was even sitting with her to begin with. But instead of, challenging the police officer, she just went quiet for a second, and then in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no, I'm from Israel." And then, before she gave up any more information, like her name or why she was here or anything, she jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. And the police officer was kind of caught off guard by this and was a little bit slow to get up and chase after her. But he ran outside too, and by the time he got out there, she had disappeared. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports like this from people who believed they saw Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings, meaning they believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia. It was not just some lookalike. And in every case, witnesses reported that this woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all over the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case still today is open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today's final story deals with a destructive, horrible, vile act that virtually anyone can do. However, there are no laws against it. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button to be the back half of your two-person horse costume for Halloween, and then when they accept, spend the night before drinking Miller Lite and eating falafel. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 2007, 60-year-old Michael Dick was living in Bow, East London with his wife and two daughters. While his life was not exactly exciting, it was good. He lived in a quiet and safe neighborhood, and Michael, who used to be a carpenter, was now semi-retired and got to spend the bulk of his time with his friends and family. But that year, something really started to bother him. 10 years prior, Michael had split up with his first wife, and after their divorce was finalized, his ex-wife and the daughter they had together, her name was Lisa, and she was 21 at the time, those two stayed in the family home in Sudbury, England, and Michael moved south about an hour and a half to Bow, East London. The divorce had been quite messy, and so Michael had not only lost touch with his ex-wife, he had also lost touch with Lisa. And so fast forward 10 years back to 2007, and Michael and Lisa had not spoken since the divorce, and Michael found himself suddenly feeling this unbelievable wave of grief over the loss of his relationship with his first child. And so after speaking with his current wife and his two other daughters, he decided that he had to go find Lisa. he had to be reunited with her. The only problem was he didn't know where Lisa lived, he didn't have her contact information, and he didn't know where his ex-wife was, so he couldn't even ask her how to get in touch with Lisa. However, he did have the street address of where they used to live in Sudbury, England, and so he decided that would be his starting point. So in August of that year, Michael and his two other younger daughters, they hopped in the car and they left Bow, East London, and they headed up to Sudbury. And when they got there, Michael navigated to his old street, which had brick houses lining each side of the road, and he drove down until he spotted his old house, and he parked right out front, and then he alone hopped out of the car and he walked up to the front door. He took a deep breath, and then he knocked on the door. When the door opened, it was not Lisa, it was not his ex-wife, it was some other family that he didn't know, and they didn't know Lisa or his ex-wife, and so they said, you know, good luck finding your daughter, but we don't have any information for you. And so Michael was crushed, but he thanked them, and he turned around, and he went back to the car, and he told his other daughters about what he had just learned, and then from there, the trio just kind of began driving around Sudbury, half looking for Lisa out on the streets, although none of them thought they would actually find her, and then also kind of discussing what they were going to do next, because now they had nothing. And so as they're driving around the streets of Sudbury, they come to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa is putting some sort of story in the local newspaper that hopefully she would see, and then she would contact Michael. And so they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and they went inside and they managed to speak to a reporter. And after telling the reporter Michael's story about how he's lost touch with Lisa, the reporter thought, you know what, this is actually a pretty interesting story, and I'd be happy to do a small feature on you guys. And so the reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his two daughters outside. They took a picture of them, and then they told Michael, you know, in the next edition of the paper that will run in a couple of days, we'll run this picture along with a little write-up about how you're looking for Lisa, and we'll put your contact information in there, and hopefully she sees it and she reaches out to you, and you can be reunited and live happily ever after. And so Michael thanked the reporter and the photographer, and then he and his other two daughters hopped in the car and headed back to Bow, East London. In 2007, at the same time that Michael was beginning his search for Lisa, Lisa was actually beginning to think, you know what, I want to go find my dad. Lisa was now 31 years old. She had 3 kids of her own. She was married. She had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. And she was thinking, you know, I really want to have a relationship with my dad again so that my kids can have a relationship with him. And so she began speaking with her mother and with friends about how she should go about finding her dad, because like Michael, she didn't have his contact information. She didn't have a phone number. She didn't know anyone who would. And then when she went on social media to look for him, he wasn't on there. And so she was kind of at a loss. Then one day in August, she was at her office and she was in the break room and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting out on the coffee table. So she picked it up and she began flipping through the pages. And then suddenly she stopped when she saw a picture of herself. She saw her and her mother walking along the streets of Sudbury. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days ago to talk to her mom about finding her dad and kind of strategies for how to go about doing that. And then Lisa glanced at the caption for this photo and she nearly fell off of her chair. The man and the 2 girls who were the main focus of this photo that Lisa was in were her father and her 2 stepsisters. She just didn't recognize them. She just saw herself in the back of this photo. So purely by chance, after being apart for over a decade, on the only day that Lisa happened to be in Sudbury talking to her mom about finding her father, she was literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were looking for her and putting out this ad in the paper to hopefully find her. And this one photo that the photographer took captured all of them in the same frame. Lisa would, of course, read the article and get her father's contact information. She would reach out, and initially Michael actually thought it was a scam and didn't believe this was actually Lisa calling to say, I found myself in the picture of you in Sudbury. But eventually he was convinced and he drove right out to Sudbury and he got a chance to meet his grandkids for the first time. And today he and Lisa are still in touch. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, BetterHelp. One of the hardest things about struggling with your mental health is that oftentimes you don't actually know you're struggling with your mental health. Before I became MrBallen on the internet, I struggled mightily with depression. However, had you asked me at the time how I felt, I would have just thought I had a bad temper, not realizing that my bad temper was a symptom of deeper issues. Luckily, I was able to go outside of my comfort zone and seek out a therapist, and with their help, I was able to change my outlook on life and become a happy person again. Because therapy has had such a positive impact on my life, I recently partnered with BetterHelp, which is a very highly reviewed online therapy platform that I currently use, and I think it's totally awesome. And so far, the people from our strange, dark, and mysterious community who have also given BetterHelp a shot, they've given us permission to share some of their feedback, and as you can see, it's very positive. BetterHelp is super easy to sign up for and use. You just fill out a questionnaire that assesses your specific needs, and then within 48 hours, you are matched up with your therapist. Then you schedule secure video and phone sessions, plus you can exchange unlimited messages, and anything you share is totally confidential. Also, you can change your therapist at any time for no additional cost. So if you are even considering trying out therapy, I highly recommend BetterHelp as your starting point. If you're interested, make sure you go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen. That is betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month. Okay, let's get back to the stories. If I told you to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would likely picture a dense tropical wilderness full of amazing and exotic animals. And you'd be right, that is a good representation of the Amazon rainforest. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive city. It's called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, right along the Amazon River. And it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. All it takes in Manaus is simply walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight, and there's virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided to make a TV show about what it was actually like to live in his hometown of Manaus. And unlike other crime shows in Brazil that often censored out the most graphic content they covered, Wallace decided he wasn't going to do that. He wanted to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus, and he felt like the only way to do that was to show everything. And so that year, he launched this show, which he called Canal Livre, which translates roughly to free channel. And true to form, there was no filter on what went on the air. And so this show was shocking. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims that are lying out in the road and slumped over chairs in restaurants and behind steering wheels. And the cameraman would zoom in on their fatal injuries, and they would zoom in on the faces of these people that have just died. Every gratuitous detail, every blood spatter, every grieving family member of the victim who's crying out in pain, all of it was shown on this TV show. And then in between these very dark and violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter side. They would bring on local artists to talk about what they're working on, to maybe try to sell some of their goods. The show would also focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help raising some money, and so the show was designed to get people to donate. And then also, for really no reason at all, there was a segment on the show where this puppet character would get into a fight with a man selling bread. It was a totally bizarre and shocking spectacle, and the people of Manaus loved it. And then eventually, the people of Brazil loved it. I mean, this was an extremely popular show. Because Wallace was often on camera on Canal Livre, he became very famous and very recognizable. And so when he would walk around Manaus, people would see him and literally just start clapping and cheering for him. And as he and his show became more and more popular across South America, Wallace decided he didn't just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight crime. So, on air, Wallace began berating the government for not being able to protect its citizens, and he berated the police for not being able to catch the criminals. And then off the air, Wallace campaigned for and was elected to political office in Manaus, where he continued to push hard to reduce crime in the city. And so it wasn't long before Wallace went from just being a relatively well-known TV host to being one of the most beloved and influential and trustworthy people in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one strange thing about his show, Canal Livre, that people just couldn't wrap their heads around. This oddity was most obvious in a now famous episode of Canal Livre that aired sometime in the mid-2000s. This episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a jungle, and there's a cameraman filming them from behind. And this reporter, they're very carefully walking through, kind of pushing branches out of the way and high-stepping over all the underbrush. And then at some point, up ahead, you see there is a clearing, and there is a third person standing in this clearing, and they're clearly looking straight down at something on the ground that we can't see. But this third person is very occupied with whatever is on the ground. And so eventually, this reporter makes their way through the jungle into this clearing, and then as soon as the cameraman gets into the clearing as well, he looks down at what is on the ground. And what you see is what appears to be a log that has previously been lit on fire because it's still smoking and it's black and it's charred. But as the cameraman zooms in, you see there are hands on this log. So you realize it's not a log, it's a human being who's obviously deceased. And based on how badly charred they are and how much they're still smoking, you realize very quickly that this person must have been on fire very recently as probably just a couple of minutes ago. Like right before the camera got here, this person was on fire. And so as you're kind of seeing this shocking image, the reporter suddenly talks about this person like he knows all the details of them already. He says, this person, it's a man, and they were not shot to death. They were doused with gasoline and burned alive. But at this point, the police had not come out. They had not seen this dead person yet. And so it made no sense that the reporter would have all this information on hand, because no one knows this stuff yet, and based on just looking at this person's body, it was too badly burned to be able to tell whether it was a man or whether they had been shot or not, or whether gasoline was used. But when Wallace was questioned about where he and his reporters got their information from, he just said, look, we're a very popular show and people call us often before they call the police, and they give us information about what's happening in the city, and we have a huge team. We watch the police headquarters, we listen to the police's radio, we watch the morgue, we have loads of informants all over the city, and so we just get our information really, really quickly. And this answer was enough until 2008. That year, in October, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who just went by the name Moa, and they accused him of 9 murders. And so they throw him in jail. But Moa, despite the seriousness of the charges against him, seems totally unfazed. It was obvious he had some sort of powerful connection outside of prison, some person or some entity that he fully expected was going to, at any moment, swoop in and magically get him out of prison. But that didn't happen. Moa just continued to sit in jail, and at some point that began to sink in that he was kind of on his own, and so he began to talk. And the story he would tell would shock Brazil. Moa would admit to having killed some people, but he would tell police, look, I'm just the assassin. The person who hired me for these killings is Wallace Souza. It would turn out Wallace Souza started his show, Canal Livre, with the best of intentions. But when his show became massively popular, and it in turn made him, Wallace, also massively popular and powerful, he became corrupt. And at some point, after his meteoric rise, he formed this very powerful drug cartel, and then in an effort to bolster his illegal dealings and to boost his show's ratings, he decided to start contracting hitmen like Moa to start taking out rival gang members in Manaus. And he would tell the hitman how he wanted them killed and where he wanted them killed and at what time. And then after the hitman agreed to do this, he, Wallace, would go tell his camera crews exactly where to go and at what time so that they would be arriving at the murder scene literally right as it was happening or right afterwards, allowing them the opportunity to get all the gory footage before anybody else. It would take the police a year to finally compile enough evidence to charge Wallace with murder, but they would do it in October of 2009, and eventually Wallace would turn himself in. However, he denied everything. And then before he went to trial, he would die of a heart attack in prison. And so we never actually got to learn the full extent of what exactly Wallace Sousa had done, how many people he had had assassinated, and how many of them were shown on his TV show. But we do know that at least 3 of his assassination victims were shown on his TV show, one of them being the person that was found out in the jungle. They really were a man. They really had not been shot. They had been burned alive with gasoline at Wallace's discretion. But in the end, the person who paid the highest price for the Canal Livre killings was Moa, the hitman who blew the whistle on what was going on with the show. On New Year's Day in 2017, a crime syndicate overran the prison where Moa was being held. Now, they had lots of targets of people they were going there to kill, and one of them was Moa. They were furious with him that he spoke to police and gave up information about the drug trade in Brazil. And so eventually, this angry mob of gangsters made their way over to Moa's cell, and when they found him, he was pressed up against the back of his cell wall, basically as far away from the bars as he possibly could be, and he began pleading for his life, and this horde was not having it. They were only there to kill him. And so they all have machetes and knives, and they're looking at him through the bars, and they say, you know, we're going to come in there, we're going to cut you to pieces. And so then they start banging on the door, they're trying to hack the lock open, and Moa, he can't do anything. All he can do is kind of just keep himself all the way to the back of the cell and hope they don't get in. And eventually, they can't open the door, and they know it. And so they do the next best thing. They reach through the bars with a lighter and they light Moa's mattress on fire. And so Moa was trapped. He had nowhere to go, and so eventually the fire reached him and he burned alive. In 2010, 18-year-old Renee Marsden was living in Sydney, Australia with her parents and her 3 siblings. Renee was a very outgoing person who had a big circle of friends, and she was also very close with her family, especially her mom, Teresa. Teresa had given birth to Renee when she was only 19 years old, and so now that Renee was a young woman, because of their closeness in ages, the two had become very close friends instead of mother and daughter. And so because of that dynamic, Renee found herself always going to her mother to tell her anything going on in her life. She was her confidant. And that year, something major had disrupted Renee's life, and so naturally she went to her mom and she told her about it. It would turn out Renee's boyfriend of nearly 2 years, who she was madly in love with, well, she discovered he was cheating on her and didn't actually even care about her. He had sent these text messages that basically said as much. And so she confronted her boyfriend with these text messages, and he denied ever sending them. He said, look, I've never cheated on you. I don't know where those came from. I promise I've been faithful to you this entire time. But Renee just wasn't buying it, and so she had felt forced to break up with him. And so Renee naturally had turned to her mother for comfort and guidance, but Teresa, all she could really offer her daughter was, to remind her that time heals all wounds, and that certainly someday you will meet the right person for you. And amazingly, only a couple of weeks after this very painful breakup, Renee came home from work one day, and she walked into the house, and she was all smiles. And considering how unbelievably depressed she had been over the last couple of weeks, this really stood out. And so when her mom saw her smiling and radiating happiness, she rushed over to her and said, what's gotten into you? Why are you in such a good mood? And Renee would tell her that, actually, I've met another guy. And so Teresa said, Who? Who did you meet? Who is this person? And she would tell her mom that his name is Braden Spiteri. He was 23 years old, and he was a graduate of the King's School, which is a really prestigious boys' school in Sydney. And his father was this really successful business person who owned this big construction company that he was set to inherit later on. And so she was just raving about how amazing this guy was. And Teresa was really happy. If nothing else, this was a very good distraction for her. And so she asked her daughter at some point, how'd you meet this guy? And Renee would tell her that Camilla had introduced them. Camilla Zaidan was Renee's best friend. They had met in high school. And Renee would explain to her mother that Braden was actually Camilla's ex-boyfriend, but they hadn't dated in a really long time, and there was no feelings between them. They were just friends at this point. And apparently, after Renee had this really painful breakup, Camilla had just felt bad for her, and so she had gone out and found the best possible match for Renee, which in her mind was this guy Braden. Teresa knew Camilla really well because she was always over the house, and she knew Teresa's intentions must have been good, but she's thinking to herself, this is bad news. You don't want to have best friends, one dating the ex-boyfriend of the other. It's just bad news waiting to happen. And so Teresa couldn't even help help herself, and she says to her daughter, "Do you really think it's a good idea to be dating Camilla's ex-boyfriend?" But Renee would tell her mom, "Look, Camilla was totally upfront with me. She just wants me to be happy. She thinks Braden is a good match for me. They don't have feelings anymore, not at all. She's totally in support." And so Teresa still very much had her doubts that this was a good idea. But she put those doubts aside, and instead she said, "Okay, well, can you show me a picture of Braden? Can I see what he looks like?" And so Renee pulls out her phone and she finds a picture of Braden and she shows it to her mom. And right away, her mom is looking at this picture and seeing that Braden is a very handsome guy, big bright smile. But she sees in this picture, Camilla is very clearly laying on his shoulder like she is his girlfriend. And so again, Teresa's thinking to herself, this is not good. Someone is going to get hurt. But over the next couple of weeks and months, Renee and Braden texted each other all the time. I mean, Renee had her phone out basically 24/7 talking to Braden. The pair had made plans to meet up and see each other in person for the first time on several different occasions, but every single time they were set to go meet, one of them would have a conflict that would make it impossible to have this face-to-face meeting. And so before long, when they just could not get a meeting established, they kind of stopped trying to have face-to-face meetings. It was almost like they had built this really strong, flourishing relationship all via their phones, and it just was getting more and more awkward to actually go out and see each other in real life. It was just more comfortable doing it all on their phones. And so this digital-only relationship between Renee and Braden continued for almost a year until January of 2012, when something horrible happened. Braden was in a horrible motorcycle accident. He survived the accident, but his passenger, his best friend, this guy named Richie, who was riding right on the back of his motorcycle, he didn't survive. He was killed in the accident. And it was determined that Braden was driving recklessly. And so he was charged with manslaughter and convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Even though Renee's mother, Teresa, was totally upset about this accident. I mean, she did understand someone had lost their life and now Braden was going to jail for 2 years. She understood the seriousness of this accident. But at the same time, there was a part of her, her motherly, protective side of her, that was kind of relieved for her daughter. She figured with Braden being out of contact for 2 years in prison, that their relationship would end and Renee could go pursue somebody else who was not an ex-boyfriend of a close friend and was someone that she could actually see in person and not just have to text with all the time. But surprisingly, after Braden was transferred to Goulburn Prison, which is where he'd be serving his 2-year sentence, it's located about 2 hours to the south of Sydney, his family smuggled a phone somehow into this jail, and he was able to continue texting with Renee. And so after he was incarcerated, they just picked up their relationship like nothing had changed. Now, Renee's family did not like this development, and they told her as much. They thought this was a bad idea, that this was the wrong path for her, but Renee didn't care. She was totally in love. And in fact, over the first couple of weeks that he was in Goulburn Prison, their relationship only intensified. They actually agreed to get married as soon as he was released at the end of 2013. And in fact, Renee had already begun making wedding preparations. She had gone on eBay and found this beautiful tiara she would wear on her wedding day, and she had contracted a wedding photographer, and she had even contacted the Greek consulate to ask if it would be okay if Braden were allowed to enter their country, because they were planning to have their honeymoon in Greece, and Braden was going to be a convicted felon, and so she needed permission for him. But in August of 2013, just 2 months before Braden's expected release date, something changed. Renee's mother, Teresa, got a text message from Braden, something she had never gotten before, and it said, "You need to check on your daughter. She's talking about killing herself." And so Teresa is totally taken aback by this message, and she goes right into Renee's bedroom where she is sitting on her bed, and her mother sits down next to her and says, "Honey, are you okay? You know, what's going on?" And Renee would look up at her mom and say, "Yeah, you know, I'm fine. What's going on with you?" And then Teresa would hold out the phone and show her the text message from Braden, and as soon as Renee saw it, she kind of sighed and looked at her mom and said, "I'm not going to hurt myself. We just broke up. Our relationship is over." Teresa knew this was going to be an extremely hard stretch of time for her daughter with another painful breakup here, but at the same time, Teresa thought to herself, this is probably for the best. That relationship just had bad news written all over it from the start, and so now she can begin to heal and move forward with her life. And so Teresa and Renee would sit in the room for a while just chatting on the bed, and then eventually Renee would tell her mom that her plans that night were to go out with her friends and cut loose and kind of just forget about this whole thing. And so Teresa sat in her bedroom on her bed as her daughter stood in front of the mirror and got ready. And then once Renee was ready, she and her mom hugged and kissed, and then Renee told her mom she'd be back soon, and then she left the house. A few hours later, Teresa received a text message from her daughter, and it started with, "Mom, I love you so much, and I'm sorry for the pain I'm about to cause you. You can still talk to me though, just call out my name and I'll be there." Teresa read this message and didn't really know what to make of it. She knew her daughter was almost certainly very upset about this breakup, but she didn't really understand the context of this message, and so she called her daughter. She didn't pick up, so she called her again, and after that second time her daughter didn't answer, she sent her a text message that just said, "Please call me back." But she sat there kind of waiting for her daughter's call, but it never came. And so Teresa, starting to feel a little bit worried about her daughter, she called Camilla and she asked her, "Hey, have you talked to Renee tonight? Because I can't get in touch with her." And Camilla would tell Teresa that actually, yeah, I just got a very strange text message from her that just said, "I love you, I'm sorry." And so at this point, the two women understood that there could be something very wrong with Renee, and so they met up and drove all around Sydney, going to all the places that Renee was known to go to. But after several hours of looking and not hearing back from Renee, they really didn't know what to do. And so the two women drove back to Teresa's house, so Renee's house, and they went inside and they sat down, and at that point, Teresa's husband and the rest of Renee's siblings, they were all there, and everyone's just kind of sitting around wondering what to do next, when around 9:30 at night, they heard a knock on the door. And it was the police coming to inform them that they had found Renee's car parked in an area that it shouldn't have been, but Renee wasn't there. And so they were coming to ask if they knew where she was and why her car might be out there. And so at this point, the family is totally terrified. They tell the police about these strange text messages, and then before long, the parents just rush outside, they hop in their cars, and they drive out to where their daughter's car is. And where Renee's car was parked was in an area called the Gap. It basically was this sheer cliff overlooking the ocean. The parents got out and they searched their daughter's car, but there was no sign of where she had gone based on the car. And so they began running up and down the cliffs. There was a sidewalk that kind of ran parallel to the edge of the cliff. And they're running up and down, hoping they're going to find their daughter, but there's no sign of her. And then at some point, Teresa climbed up to one of the highest points of the cliff. And when she got up there, she found her daughter's black flat shoes. And they were placed neatly together on the ground right in front of the fence that was there to prevent people from getting too close to the edge of the cliff. But despite an extensive search that night, they couldn't find any sign of Renee. She was nowhere to be found. However, the police would discover the following day that there was actually a camera that was looking at that section of the cliffs. And so they reviewed this footage and they found Renee. They saw what happened to her. And in this camera footage, you see Renee walking up the trail in the middle of the night, and she stops and she takes off her shoes and she puts them down, and then she hops over that fence. Now, the fence was not right up against the very edge of the cliff. It was set back maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so she hops over the fence, and then she steps very carefully to the edge of the cliff, and she kind of peeks over the edge and then looks visibly terrified, and she moves backwards a few steps until her back is pressed up against the fence. And then she pulls out her phone and she sends 3 text messages. One was to her mother, which is the text about how she loved her and she was sorry for the pain she was going to cause her. And then the other 2 text messages were to Camilla and also to Braden. However, to this day, we don't actually know what either of those text messages said. And then after sending these 3 text messages, Renee takes her phone and she throws it off the cliff into the water. And then she sat down and began kind of shimmying herself forward towards the edge. Now, the camera did not actually pick her up falling off the cliff, but it's assumed when she went out of frame that she had fallen off the cliff to her death. Her body would never be recovered. Renee's death was ruled a suicide. However, her family, in addition to being totally devastated by this horrible loss, they felt totally confused. They had no idea why this had happened, but they were certain it had to have something to do with this recent breakup with Braden Spiteri. And so they tried to get in touch with Braden, but he wasn't getting back in touch with them. And so the family contacted the police and said, "Can you reach out to the prison where he is and set up a meeting?" And so the police obliged them and they called Goulburn Prison. And when they spoke to the prison, they said, "Who? Braden who? Yeah, we don't have a Braden Spiteri here. We never have. And the reason was, Braden Spiteri wasn't real. Renee's friend, Camilla, had made him up. He was a fictitious person. That picture of Braden Spiteri where Camilla is laying on his shoulder, that was just some random person she had met in a club. Camilla had always been very possessive of Renee ever since they had met in high school, and at some point, she had just decided that she wanted even more control over Renee. And so the first thing she did is she convinced Renee that her earlier boyfriend, the one she'd been dating for 2 years before Braden, she convinced Renee that he had been cheating on her the whole time, he was unfaithful, that he didn't love her, and then she had created those text messages and given them to Renee and convinced Renee that that was something he had said, and before long, Renee totally believed it. She approached her boyfriend, he denied it, but Camilla the whole time is telling Renee, he's lying to you, he's been doing this whole time, I know he's a bad guy, and so Renee had listened to her best friend, and she had severed that relationship. And then almost immediately after that, Camilla swoops in to the rescue and connects Renee with this Braden guy, Camilla's supposed ex-boyfriend, who really was just Camilla on the other side of the phone. And for nearly 2 years, Camilla kept this charade up, and Renee completely believed this was a real person, that Braden was her boyfriend. She loved him. And eventually, in June of 2013, so 2 months before Renee died, she confided in Braden, aka Camilla, that her friend Camilla was toxic and mean and controlling, and she didn't want to be her friend anymore. And so Camilla, she's reading this and she's furious. And so she decides the only way to get revenge on Renee and regain control of her is to have Braden break up with her. And so 2 months later, on August 5th, 2013, so on the day that Renee died, she was out to lunch at around 1 p.m. with a coworker when she gets a text message from Braden that just kind of comes out of the blue, and it says, "I need a break from you." Now, this is around the time that they're planning their wedding. And so Renee is totally heartbroken, and she's trying to get in touch with him and call him. He's not picking up. And then fast forward to about 2:45 p.m. that afternoon, we know Renee called Goulburn Prison. It was the first time she had done that. Now, we don't know who she spoke to or what they actually talked about, but it's nearly guaranteed that she learned Braden Spiteri was not being held there. And so almost certainly she would have realized that Braden is either not real or Braden had been lying to her in such a huge way that the relationship could never work. And so no matter what, this chapter of her life was totally over. And so later that day, when she was sitting on her bed in her bedroom and her mom came in and she asked her how she was doing, it's very likely that Renee was devastated. She was crushed and probably kind of embarrassed about how badly she had just been duped by this Braden person, whoever that was. And so even though normally Renee would tell her mother everything, her mother was her confidant, she loved her mother, it was like she just couldn't bring herself to discuss what was happening to her. It was just so enormous, it was so overwhelming that she hid it from her mother. And instead, she just got dressed up, said goodbye to her mom, and then she headed out to the cliffs. No charges were ever brought against Camilla because catfishing, which is exactly what she was doing, which is using a fictitious online persona to lure people into relationships, well, that's not considered a crime in Australia. And Camilla, despite being pressed by the police and Renee's family, has never taken responsibility for this and has never apologized. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the like button to be the back half of your 2-person horse costume for Halloween. And after they accept, spend the night before drinking Miller Lite and eating falafel. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast where we put out brand new, never before heard content on Monday mornings. And also on Thursday, we re-upload YouTube content, but we remastered the audio. This podcast is called MrBallen Podcast, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you find your podcasts, it will be there. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is @MrBallen, and then just send me a direct message. I actually do read the bulk of my messages. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is just called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and and lost episodes. And the other YouTube channel is just called MrBallen en Español, and it's a Spanish language channel. We also have a Facebook page just called @MrBallen that puts out near daily content. We also have a Snapchat channel called MrBallen that puts out content on Sundays. We have some really cool merchandise. If you want to check it out, go to shopmrballen.com. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, podcasts, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, I'm going to be sharing 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the pictures that are famously associated with them. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to install brand new hardwood floors in the like button's home, and on installation day, show up and remove all the old flooring, but then quit the job. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1987, 21-year-old Deanna Wild had just separated from her husband, and she was living with her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ McGinnis, who were both 54 years old. On April 2nd of that year, the trio decided to visit Big Sur, which is the very beautiful, but very steep and dangerous section of the Central California coastline. They pulled over at a particular cliff overlooking the water to take some pictures. Afterwards, as they were getting ready to go back to their car, Deanna wanted a closer look, so she stepped to the edge of the cliff where she lost her footing and she fell 500 feet to her death. It was ruled an accident, so investigating officers refrained from taking any on-scene photographs, accepting instead Virginia's photographs that she said she had taken right before it happened. Deanna's mother was unable to afford a funeral for her daughter, and so the only person she could think to ask to help her was a lawyer that went to the same church as her. His name was Steve Keeney, and Steve said, yeah, of course, I'll try to make some phone calls for you and see what I can do. And in doing so, he wound up learning about the case, about what happened to Deanna, and he discovered that her 2 friends, Virginia and BJ, had actually taken a life insurance policy out on Deanna the day before she fell off the cliff. And so Steve began digging into the backgrounds of Virginia and BJ, and he discovered that Virginia had a history of being around a high number of accidental deaths and suspicious fires, and that she had cashed in a whole bunch of life insurance policies. So all of a sudden, Deanna's death did not look accidental. Steve would become obsessed with the idea that the McGinnises were behind Deanna's death, but unfortunately, there was virtually no evidence to support that, because when she died, the investigating officers ruled it an accident. So there was no crime scene, there was no evidence collected, the autopsy was very cursory. And so Steve would spend 5 years building a case against Virginia and BJ, but at the end of those 5 years, it was a rock-solid case, and Virginia and BJ were arrested. During their trial, the real story of what happened to Deanna finally emerged. On that April day in 1987, the trio went to Big Sur, and they had lunch together, they had a picnic, and while they were eating, BJ slipped some of his prescription antidepressants into Deanna's drink, and so after lunch, the drugs were in Deanna's system, and she began to get very drowsy, to the point where Virginia and BJ had to literally hold her up. She was falling over. She was so tired. And so while Deanna's in the state, Virginia and BJ tell her, hey, let's go over to the cliffs and take some pictures. And so they walk over, Deanna's stumbling and BJ's holding her up, and they get to the edge of the cliff, and BJ turns around so the ocean's at his back, and he's propping up Deanna, and Virginia steps away and she takes their picture. And then right after that picture, BJ, while still holding Deanna, turned around to face the water and kind of carried Deanna right to the edge, and Virginia took one more picture of them facing the water. And then right after that picture was taken, BJ took Deanna and threw her off the cliff. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this case is that as soon as he threw her off, Deanna kind of came to and whipped herself around and managed to grab onto the cliff with her hands. And so she's literally dangling, holding onto this ledge like in the movies, begging to be pulled back up. And Virginia and BJ, instead of helping her back up, picked up rocks and bashed her hands until she fell off the cliff. Ultimately, it would be these last two pictures that Virginia took that got her and BJ convicted of killing Deanna, because these pictures clearly showed Deanna was impaired compared to the earlier pictures on the camera roll. And the only reason these pictures existed is because Virginia wanted a trophy from the killing, because she was actually an uncaught serial killer that went around killing people and cashing in their life insurance policies. One of her victims even included her own 3-year-old daughter. BJ would actually die during his trial. As for Virginia, she was found guilty and sent to jail for life. Here are the final two pictures that Virginia took of Deanna. On July 30th, 2016, Janice Stewart was at home in College Station, Texas, preparing for a wedding she was going to be photographing the following week. Her 34-year-old daughter, named Sunday Rowan, lived a few hours away in San Antonio, and she was planning to go with her to help her take these pictures. As Janice worked, her cell phone kept buzzing. Since sunrise, Sunday had been Snapchatting her photos of her and her husband Matt, who was also 34, as they got ready for their hot air balloon ride that day. 18 months earlier, Sunday had bought Matt the tickets as a birthday gift, but the trip kept getting delayed because of bad weather. But on this July morning, the weather had cleared up and the trip was finally happening. Sunday and Matt often sought adventure to balance the demands of their jobs. Matt was the chief of clinical trials at the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio and was a rising star in the field of burn research. Sunday worked at Crazy 8, which was a kids' clothing store, and she was devoted to her young son from a previous relationship. At 6:58 that morning, Janice received an image of the balloon's ground crew prepping the wicker basket that would hold her daughter, her son-in-law, and the rest of the other passengers. Around 7:30, Janice received another image. This one was a selfie of Sunday and Matt posing inside of the wicker basket. They were up in the air. There's a beautiful field below them. They're smiling and they're hugging. After that, the messages stopped. 10 minutes later, at 7:40, 85-year-old Buddy Miller was making breakfast in his ranch when he heard two loud explosions. The first one actually rattled his house. When he looked out the window, he saw this massive plume of black smoke on another rancher's land off in the distance. Alarmed, he jumped in his pickup truck and raced past his cows to the blaze a half-mile away. Commotion like this rarely occurred in Maxwell, Texas, a quiet rural community about 40 miles south of Austin. At her home just up the road was 66-year-old Margaret Wiley, who heard the explosions too. She said the first one reminded her of the sound her 20-gauge shotgun made. When she stepped onto the porch, she heard the second explosion, and she said it sounded like a loud pop, followed by a whooshing sound, like the sound a gas stove makes when it ignites. When she looked out towards where the sounds had come from, she saw this massive fireball explode in the distance, and she immediately called 911. When Buddy and the other first responders arrived at the scene, they saw this huge fire at the base of a power line tower, and at first they couldn't figure out what was actually burning. They heard the sound of hissing propane tanks and thought maybe it was a tractor or a baler that had caught on fire, but upon closer inspection, they saw a wicker basket and they saw bodies. This was a hot air balloon accident. It would turn out the pilot of that hot air balloon was 49-year-old Skip Nichols, and he had elected to fly that day despite a low cloud cover that had grounded the other hot air balloon companies in the area that morning. Also, Skip was on a mixture of prescription and over-the-counter drugs that impaired his ability to fly the balloon safely. After being in the air for 8 miles above the clouds, Skip decided it was time to land, and so he blindly descended through the clouds and he immediately hit a power line. An arc carrying 340,000 volts of electricity cut the balloon's metal support cables like a torch. As soon as the basket began plummeting toward the earth, the fuel lines disconnected from the burners overhead, spraying liquid propane up into the burners and then arced back down into the wicker basket, immediately engulfing the entire thing in flames. The burning basket fell over 100 feet to the ground. By 10 a.m. that morning, Janice had still not heard from her daughter after that last text she sent, which included the picture of her and Matt, that selfie image up in the balloon, and Janice was concerned that something had gone wrong. So she turned on the TV, and the first thing she sees is hot air balloon crash in Texas, no survivors. And on the screen, she immediately recognized the smiley face that was on the balloon that had crashed, because she recognized it from the images her daughter had sent her. Even before she got the official call, she knew instinctively that her daughter and her son-in-law were both gone. Here are the final pictures taken of Sunday, Matt, and the other 14 people who were on board that balloon. On September 25th, 1978, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 jet airliner entered San Diego airspace. Like all PSA aircraft, Flight 182 had a whimsical black button nose and smiley face painted underneath the cockpit. These so-called grinning birds were synonymous with the company's self-promoting ad campaign about them being the world's friendliest airline. But the airline was often criticized for being too friendly with their super low airfares, their kind of comic banter that the captains would employ through the intercom to passengers, and their female flight attendants who wore miniskirts and were instructed to make nice with the male passengers. Because the weather was clear, air traffic control directed Captain McFerrin and First Officer Fox to switch from instrument flight rules to visual flight rules procedures and to begin their final descent. Visual flight rules refers to pilots using their eyes to guide the plane. It's done when they're flying low, the weather's clear, and they can see the ground. At 8:59 a.m. that morning, as PSA Flight 182 descended down to 4,000 feet, air traffic control advised them of a Cessna, which is a small plane, that was ascending in their direction. Fox responded that they saw the Cessna, and so air traffic control came back and said to maintain visual separation. Maintain visual separation meant that despite ground radar-based controllers who could provide vertical and lateral separation criteria, the burden for maintaining separation fell solely on Captain McFerrin and his crew. In layman's terms, air traffic control was telling them, don't lose sight of the Cessna. Inside the Cessna was a flight instructor named Martin Casey and his student, who was a United States Marine named David Boswell. As this little plane ascended, air traffic control informed them that PSA 182, who was right in front of them and slightly above them, they were on their descent. However, they had the Cessna in sight. As a result, the men inside of the Cessna did not take it upon themselves to actively begin looking for this jet. They assumed the pilots of PSA 182, who had them in sight, would avoid them. Back in PSA 182, there seemed to be some confusion in the cockpit. The two pilots were debating whether the Cessna they were watching fly lower than them, past them on the right, was the same Cessna that air traffic control had told them about. And at some point they agreed, yep, that's got to be the same Cessna. And so they called in to air traffic control that it looks like the Cessna has passed us. They've flown past us on the right. Immediately after this transmission, the black box recorded the two pilots talking to each other, basically trying to convince the other that yes, that was definitely the right Cessna. But after a couple of minutes of reassuring themselves, one of them says, boy, I hope that was the right Cessna. According to later testimony by the air traffic controller who was in communication with the pilots of PSA 182 as they were on their final descent, he would say when Captain McFerrin came over and said the Cessna has passed him on the right, he believed him and he didn't think to check to make sure it was the right one. But in reality, the Cessna that McFerrin and Fox had seen was the wrong one. The real Cessna they were supposed to maintain visual separation with, the one containing Casey and Boswell, was still ascending in the direct flight path of PSA 182, except now this Cessna is in 182's blind spot below their nose, so they literally can't see each other. At 9:01 that morning, air traffic control got an alarm that PSA 182 and this Cessna are about to collide, but for some reason the air traffic controller did not alert both aircraft. Instead, this controller only contacted the Cessna and didn't tell them this was a dire situation. They said, hey, there's traffic in your vicinity, but I'm pretty sure it's just PSA 182 and they already see you, so you're fine. So Casey and Boswell inside of the Cessna just continued to ascend. 1 minute later, at 9:02 a.m., PSA 182 flies directly over the Cessna and strikes them with their nose wheel. The Cessna gets hooked by the wheel and flips upside down and gets trapped underneath the right wing of the jet. Seconds later, the Cessna splits in two. The tail section containing David Boswell plummets to the earth like a rag doll. The nose section of the Cessna that contained Martin Casey stayed trapped underneath the right wing for a few seconds before it detonated. Inside of PSA 182, this explosion was deafening, and immediately after it, McFerrin was recorded saying, easy baby, easy baby. Then he asks Fox, what's the damage? And Fox says, it's bad, man, we're hit. Despite trying to keep the plane flying level, it lurched forward into an unrecoverable nosedive, and McFerrin, knowing they were doomed, calmly calls out to air traffic control and says, we're going down. Air traffic responded, okay, we'll have the equipment ready for you. Then the black box recorded the sound of a stall warning inside the cockpit, and as the aircraft streaked at over 300 miles per hour straight towards the ground, McFerrin's last known transmission to air traffic was, this is it, baby. Seconds before impact, McFerrin gave his final command over the intercom, which was "brace yourselves," and then right before the black box cut out, someone in the cabin yelled, "I love you, Mom." At 9:03 a.m., PSA 182 slammed nose first into the ground just outside of downtown San Diego in an area called North Park. The resulting explosion of thousands of gallons of jet fuel sent a shockwave that was registered 2 miles away. Almost immediately, firefighters were rushing towards the rising mushroom cloud of black, oily smoke, and many of the first responders that arrived at the crash site in those first few hours were deeply disturbed at what they saw. The bodies that had not been destroyed in the explosion had gotten trapped up in the trees. All told, 144 people were killed in this accident. 135 were from PSA 182, 2 were from the Cessna, and 7 were just unlucky people that were standing on the ground in North Park. Following a 1-year investigation into the midair collision, it was determined that the flight crew of PSA 182 was found to be primarily responsible because there was that moment that was picked up in the black box where the 2 pilots were unsure if the Cessna that passed them was the right one, but instead of calling that into air traffic control and getting confirmation, they blew it off. The morning of the crash, a San Diego photographer was at a press event when he heard the explosion overhead, which was 182 colliding with the Cessna, and he began taking pictures, and he captured these now 2 infamous photos of PSA 182 seconds before they hit the ground. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to install brand new, beautiful hardwood floors at the Like Button's house. And on installation day, remove all of their original flooring and then quit the job. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions inside the woods of North America. I'm talking about people being right in front of someone and then in a second they're gone and they're never found again. Or somebody goes missing and then they're found again, but in a location that's impossible to get to. One former police detective named David Politis has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to look at 3 of his cases that even amongst strange disappearances, these stand out as particularly bizarre. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a hot pocket, but don't let it stand in the microwave for 2 minutes. Instead, serve it to them immediately so that when they bite into it, they are met with the tongue-scalding cheese lava flow within. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In the evening hours of January 12, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was attending a party in his hometown of Osborne, Idaho. Towards the end of the night, Dylan decided he wanted to leave the party, but it was snowing and cold outside, so he called his mom and he asked her if she would come pick him up at the gas station just down the road from the house he was at. His mother would say it was obvious Dylan had been drinking because he was slurring his words, but at the time, even though she was upset about it because he was underage, she thought, you know what, it's cold, it's snowing, I just want to get my kid home safe and we'll deal with this tomorrow. So she agreed to pick him up. She hopped in the car and began driving to this gas station, and as she's driving, she gets another call from her son. This time, he sounds totally panicked and scared, and he's asking his mom, where are you? Where are you, Mom? And she's telling him, I'm going to be there in a minute. I'm just down the road. Calm down. I'll be there in a minute. And then he hung up. When she got to the gas station, he wasn't there. When she tried calling him back, his phone was off. She got out of the car and went into the gas station and asked if they'd seen her son, and they said they hadn't. She got back in the car and she drove around for about 30 minutes yelling for her son, but there was no sign of him. She still couldn't get in touch with him. His phone was still off, and she just had this bad feeling that something had happened to him, so she called the police. The police conducted a thorough search that started with the house Dylan had been at for this party. They interviewed the people who were there, and everybody said Dylan seemed fine, and he just left. He said he was getting picked up by his mom. But as they looked around town, they just could not find any sign of him. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident by two people that crashed their ATVs in the middle of the night and then went back in the daytime the next day to retrieve their ATVs, and that's when they found Dylan's body. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. Now, toxicology reports showed Dylan had been under the influence of alcohol, but this was his hometown. He certainly knew where the gas station was, and he would have known he was walking in the complete wrong direction, especially when you consider walking towards the gas station was like walking towards the center of town. There was lots of lights, lots of indication you're going in the right direction. To walk in the other direction towards that hill where he was found would have been like walking towards darkness, where there's no lights, there's no sign of town. It's obviously the wrong direction. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. And from the time Dylan went missing until he was found, it didn't snow, and the temperature did not heat up enough to melt the snow. So in theory, any tracks Dylan would have made, they would still be there when he was found. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. And so you would think for him to make it all the way up to this spot on the hillside through kind of rough, rocky, snowy terrain through a forest, that you would expect his socks to be totally ruined and his feet to potentially be cut up. But his socks were clean and his feet were uninjured. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks. And then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. While he determined Dylan's cause of death to be hypothermia, the deputy coroner, David Roos, was convinced there was something off about this case. After local authorities came out and said Dylan's death was an accident, David became very vocal in the media saying he disagreed and he thought Dylan had been attacked. But the county never reinvestigated Dylan's case, and in fact, they went on to fire David Roos, the coroner, saying he was no longer qualified to do the job. David says they fired him to keep him quiet. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. Dustin Self was born and raised in Piedmont, Oklahoma, which is a small community just northwest of Oklahoma City. Growing up, Dustin had always been kind of a mediocre performer with so-so grades, didn't take things too seriously, but in his senior year, he discovered weightlifting, and it seemed to give his life a much-needed sense of purpose, and it really kind of helped him organize all aspects of his life. So by the time he was graduating, he was not only in great physical shape, he had also managed to raise all of his grades up significantly, and he seemed to be on a path to success. But interestingly, after high school, he didn't pursue higher education, he didn't go get a job, he didn't try to spend more time with friends and family. Instead, he decided he wanted to go live in the wild. His family believed this was due to his obsession with the Hollywood film Into the Wild, which is about the true story of Christopher McCandless, who gives up a promising career to go live off in the wilds of Alaska. Christopher would ultimately die in the wilds of Alaska after eating a poisonous plant, or some say he died from starvation. So about a year after Dustin's high school graduation, he was 19 years old, it was March of 2013, and he finally felt like he was ready to go live out this dream of living in the wild. And so he told his family he was going to go on this cross-country road trip, stopping at different points along the way, living out in the woods. His family knew he was really fixated on this and couldn't talk him out of it, and so they ultimately accepted it and said, just be really careful. So in early March, Dustin heads out on this road trip, and nobody hears from him until March 15th, when he calls his parents and says, I'm in this tiny town called Fields, Oregon, and I'm at a gas station. Everything's going great, nothing to worry about. The very next day, Dustin called his ex-girlfriend and told her he was lost on a mountain. And his ex-girlfriend said she couldn't really understand what he was saying, and she was actually at the airport about to board a plane, so it was noisy, and she stepped into a bathroom to hear him more clearly. But even as she's hearing him, what he was saying just wasn't making any sense. He was talking about this mountain he was lost on, and he was referencing that there were people that were after him, and it was just very confusing. And before she could get any more clarifying information from Dustin, he hung up, and then she couldn't get back in touch with him. So she calls Dustin's father, and she tells him that she had this really weird conversation with Dustin where he said he's lost on this mountain. And even though I didn't really understand what he was telling me, he sounded really, really scared. Dustin's father thanked her and then spent the rest of the day trying to get in touch with his son, but every time he called, it just went straight to voicemail. The next day, when he still hadn't heard from his son, he called the police. The police did not have a great idea of where to start looking for him because Dustin did not specify to his ex-girlfriend what mountain he was actually lost on. All they had was his last known location, which was that gas station in Fields, Oregon. So they went to that gas station and he wasn't there, and they asked the people that worked there if they remembered Dustin, and they didn't, and no one knew anything about him. And so after that, they just had to wait for more leads to come in because they couldn't just, search all the mountains in Oregon for Dustin. They would never find him. A month later, after no one's heard from Dustin, a ranch hand who was living in a very rural section of Oregon, not far from the gas station in Fields, Oregon, discovered Dustin's truck parked precariously on the edge of this road inside of a canyon. It was abandoned, but inside were Dustin's GPS, some food, and some energy drinks. His backpack that contained his sleeping bag and his tent were missing. There was a comprehensive search done around where the truck had been found, but after a couple of days, nothing had been found and the search was terminated. The area around where Dustin's truck was found was very hilly and rocky, but there weren't that many trees, which meant if you were standing on one of the different mountains in the area, you'd be able to very easily look out and actually see a road. And so the searchers were thinking to themselves, how could this guy have gotten lost on any of these mountains? Because all he'd have to do is look over there and there's a road, and therefore there's help. 6 months later, a hunter was up in those mountains near where Dustin's truck was found, and he was actually moving through one of these small sections of aspen trees. And as he was walking through, he thought he saw a deer, and he was kind of stalking through these trees, and he gets to an opening where he looks down and he stops, because underneath the bush is an obviously dead man not wearing any clothes, who's on his hands and knees, and it looks like his head is stuck in the ground. When the hunter walks over to get a better look, it looks like this guy must have pushed his head into a hole in the ground before he succumbed to whatever killed him. The hunter leaves and tells police. Police show up, they search the area, and they find a jacket nearby, inside of which is a wallet that contains Dustin's ID cards, as well as Dustin's car keys. The body was Dustin's. Dustin was located 9 miles away from where his truck had been parked on that road, and nowhere in the area did they find a campsite. They actually never found his backpack that contained the tent or the sleeping bag, so they think he never set up camp, but they don't know where his supplies went. After Dustin's family found out what happened to him, his father would say, I just don't understand why he didn't seek shelter in his vehicle. It was parked on the road, he wasn't that far away. Heck, he could have run those 9 miles. He was in great physical shape, and in theory, he would have known where he parked it, or if he didn't, he could have just walked to the edge of the mountain and looked out and seen the road it was parked on. So the family just couldn't understand his decision-making. Investigators would say there was no indication Dustin was trying to hurt himself and foul play was ruled out. So what was it that caused Dustin to abandon his car and walk 9 miles uphill and ditch his clothes and ditch his backpack that contained his tent and his sleeping bag, and then stick his head in a hole until he died? The only thing that could be determined was that Dustin probably died of hypothermia, but because of the state his body was in from decomposition, the coroner said we don't know for sure. So like all the other missing 411 cases, we're left with lots of questions and not a lot of answers. In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry, and periodically she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said, "The woods just went completely silent. Very odd." As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a see-through person that had been wrapped in saran wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it, and I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing, so I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself, the idea that she'd just seen a saran wrap person running through the treetops. She just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head, and as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens, and that's it. That night, when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point, all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds. And then at some point, the light kind of went back into the forest and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened. And it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing. And as soon as he finishes, she says, what time did he say that happened? Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him. And so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, here, let me take a look at it. As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, well, did your hair get in front of the lens? And she said, no, I was holding it about a foot away from my head and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair. And so he looked at it again and he asked her, well, did you put your finger over the lens maybe? And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, like, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, no, I don't even know how to do that. So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a hot pocket, but instead of letting it stand in the microwave for 2 minutes, serve it immediately so when they bite down, they're met with the tongue-scalding cheese lava flow within. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallin416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.